There is a point at which wanting something stops helping you move toward it and starts changing you. At first, the desire is clean. You want the job. You want the person. You want the money. You want the opportunity. You want the audience. You want the answer. You want the breakthrough. And there is nothing wrong with that. Desire by itself is not the problem. Desire can organize a life. It can sharpen attention. It can give direction to effort. It can pull a person out of apathy and into motion. But then something changes. You send the message and check whether it was seen. You submit the application and refresh your inbox. You publish the work and watch the numbers. You finish the interview and replay every sentence you said. You make the investment and keep checking the account. You start building something, and every day becomes a referendum on whether it is working. You fall in love and begin studying changes in tone, timing, warmth, distance. You pursue success and slowly stop experiencing the work itself because your entire nervous system is waiting for proof. At some point, you are no longer simply moving toward what you want. You are circling it, monitoring it, negotiating with it, trying to force certainty out of something that has not yet decided what it will become. And the strangest part is this: the thing may not have changed at all. You have. The job is still the job. The person is still the person. The goal is still the goal. But now the desire has become heavier. It is carrying something it was never meant to carry. Your self-respect, your peace, your future, your sense of whether life is going well, your belief that you are worthy, your belief that you are safe, your belief that you are enough. This is where wanting becomes dependence. And once desire becomes dependence, you no longer ask only, "Do I want this?" You begin asking, "What does it mean about me if I do not get it?" That is a different question, a dangerous one, because the moment an outcome becomes responsible for proving your worth, your behavior around that outcome begins to change. You become less patient, less perceptive, less capable of tolerating ambiguity. You start interpreting delays as rejection, silence as evidence, uncertainty as danger. You interfere too early. You change strategies too often. You overexplain. You chase reassurance. You become obsessed with signs. You confuse movement with progress. You confuse intensity with effectiveness. And sometimes, without realizing it, you begin to destroy the very conditions that would have helped you succeed. A person waiting for an important reply can feel this in the body. There's a slight tightening, a pull toward the phone. One more check, one more refresh, one more interpretation, one more attempt to make the unknown become known before it is ready. And for a few seconds, checking helps. The inbox loads. The message screen opens. The analytics refresh. The account balance appears. Nothing has changed, but the mind receives a tiny dose of temporary relief because it has done something. Then the uncertainty returns. So you check again and again. Soon, you are not checking for information. You are checking for emotional regulation. That distinction matters, because a rational person measures reality in order to make decisions. An anxious person can begin measuring reality in order to feel safe. Those are not the same thing. And when the second becomes habitual, you can spend your life collecting information that never gives you peace. The Stoics understood one part of this problem centuries ago. Epictetus built much of his philosophy around a distinction between what belongs to us and what does not. Our judgments, our choices, our actions, our responses, these are ours to work with. But outcomes involving other people, circumstances, timing, reputation, approval, luck, and external events are never completely ours. The problem begins when we try to control the second category with the tools of first. We act, then worry as if worry were another action. We prepare, then rehearse fear as if fear were preparation. We send the message, then mentally follow it into the other person's mind. We publish the work, then try to control who discovers it. We apply, then attempt to influence a decision that is already outside our hands. And because the result matters deeply, we tell ourselves that this constant internal activity is responsibility. Sometimes it is not responsibility at all. Sometimes it is fear wearing the clothes of effort. That is the territory of this book, not the elimination of desire, not indifference, not pretending not to care, not becoming passive, not sitting back and telling yourself that whatever happens was meant to happen, and certainly not the shallow promise that if you let go, some invisible force will automatically deliver the thing you wanted. Detachment is more demanding than that. It asks you to keep caring without becoming captive, to keep acting without turning action into compulsion, to keep wanting without needing the outcome to prove that your life has value. You may continue pursuing the goal while ending the internal chase. That sounds simple. It is not, because the chase often disguises itself as ambition. A person says, "I am just driven," but beneath the drive may be terror. "I cannot fail." A person says, "I just care deeply about the relationship," but beneath the care may be fear. "If they leave, I will collapse." A person says, "I am just committed to my business," but beneath the commitment may be dependence. "If this does not succeed, I do not know who I am." A person says, "I am just checking progress," but beneath the checking may be a need for reassurance. Tell me that I am not wasting my time. Tell me that I am getting closer. Tell me that I made the right decision. Tell me that I am going to be okay. This is why chasing is not always visible from the outside. Two people can work 12-hour days toward the same goal. One is chasing. The other is not. The difference is not necessarily effort. It is psychological dependence. One person works intensely because the work matters. The other works intensely because failure has become emotionally unacceptable. One can rest. The other cannot. One can absorb feedback. The other experiences feedback as threat. One can adapt. The other panics. One can wait. The other experiences waiting as unbearable. That is why detachment is often misunderstood. People hear the word and think it means caring less. But healthy detachment often allows you to care more intelligently. A surgeon who is overwhelmed by terror cannot perform better merely because the patient matters. An athlete who is obsessed with not losing may become rigid. A speaker who desperately needs approval may stop communicating and start performing for validation. A creator who checks numbers every few minutes may abandon good work because the first response was weak. A person in love may create distance by demanding constant reassurance that distance is not forming. The pattern is almost cruel. The more desperately you need certain outcomes to regulate your inner world, the harder it can become to behave in ways that support those outcomes. This is not mystical resistance. It is human psychology. Desperation narrows perception. Fear changes judgment. Scarcity changes behavior. Compulsive reassurance strengthens the need for more reassurance. Over-monitoring increases sensitivity to fluctuation. Attachment to one result makes alternatives harder to see. The goal begins to occupy too much mental territory. And once it does, every event becomes about it. A quiet day becomes evidence. A delayed reply becomes evidence. One poor performance becomes evidence. A drop in numbers becomes evidence. A neutral facial expression becomes evidence. Soon you are no longer experiencing reality directly. You are experiencing reality through the question, is this a sign that I am getting what I want? That question can poison a life, because even good moments become incomplete. If the result has not arrived yet, you cannot fully enjoy today. If the person has not reassured you yet, the evening is ruined. If the numbers have not increased yet, the work feels meaningless. If the money has not come yet, progress feels fake. If the opportunity has not appeared yet, effort feels invisible. You keep postponing permission to feel settled, and the future keeps moving the requirement. When this happens, desire has stopped being a direction. It has become a condition. I will be okay when I will relax, when I will feel successful, when I will feel attractive, when I will feel secure, when I will trust myself, when I will finally breathe. When that sentence can keep a person running for decades. The object changes. The structure does not. First it is the degree, then the job, then the promotion, then the house, then the relationship, then the marriage, then the money, then the recognition, then the body, then the next achievement. The finish line keeps changing because the real problem was never the finish line. The real problem was the agreement you made with it. You promised an external result that if it arrived, you would finally give yourself something internally: peace, worth, permission, security, enoughness. And that is too much power to give any result, even the result you desperately want. This is why the deeper question is not, how do I stop wanting? It is, what happens inside me when wanting becomes dependence? Why does desperation make intelligent people behave against their own interests? Why does constant checking make uncertainty harder to tolerate rather than easier? Why can other people often feel when our attention contains pressure? Why does releasing control sometimes improve performance? How can a person stop forcing without becoming passive? How do you know when patience is wisdom and when patience has become avoidance? And what do you do when you have acted wisely, worked hard, stayed disciplined, and nothing appears to be changing? These questions cannot be answered with one sentence about letting go. They require a more uncomfortable examination, because detachment does not only ask you to change what you do, it asks you to examine why you are doing it. It asks what the goal has come to mean. It asks what fear is hiding underneath your urgency. It asks why silence feels intolerable. It asks why one person's approval can suddenly feel more important than your own judgment. It asks why a number on a screen can decide whether a day feels successful. It asks what you have handed over to outcomes that never belonged to them. And eventually, it asks something even harder. If the thing never came, who would you be? Not what would you do. Who would you be? Would you still know yourself? Would you still respect yourself? Would you still have a life? Would your identity survive the answer? That question reveals the real depth of attachment. Viktor Frankl observed, in essence, that certain human experiences become harder to achieve when they are made into direct objects of pursuit. Happiness is one of them. Success can be another. When they become targets that must be secured at all costs, attention turns inward and performance can become distorted. This does not mean stop pursuing meaningful goals. It means that some outcomes arrive most naturally as consequences of how you live, work, relate, and act, not as objects you can psychologically strangle into existence. There is a difference between direction and fixation, between commitment and captivity, between love and possession, between discipline and compulsion, between action and interference, between patience and helpless waiting, between surrender and defeat. This book lives inside those differences. And one of the most important distinctions we will return to is this. You can give a goal your effort without giving it your identity. You can give someone your love without giving them responsibility for your worth. You can give a project your discipline without allowing its performance to determine whether you respect yourself. You can care deeply without becoming emotionally owned by the answer. That is detachment, not coldness, not withdrawal, not pretending. Freedom, the kind of freedom that allows a person to say, I want this very much, and I will still be myself if life says no. That sentence contains more power than it first appears to, because once you can say it truthfully, you begin making different decisions. You stop bargaining with reality. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop reacting to every fluctuation. You become capable of waiting without collapsing into interpretation. You begin to see alternatives. You communicate more honestly. You work with greater steadiness. You recover faster. You stop forcing doors that are not opening and start noticing doors you could not see while staring at one locked entrance. Most importantly, you stop abandoning yourself in the pursuit of something outside yourself. And that is where the story begins. Because before we can understand attachment, we have to understand the chase, not the visible chase, the internal one, the silent one, the one that continues long after the message has been sent, long after the application has been submitted, long after the work has been done, long after there is anything left to control. The chase that says, one more thought, one more check, one more sign, one more push, one more attempt to make uncertainty disappear. But uncertainty does not disappear because you chase it. Sometimes you only teach yourself that uncertainty is something you cannot survive. So the first question is not whether you should want less. It is whether you can want deeply without turning desire into fear. Because the moment fear takes control of desire, effort begins to change. And what feels like determination can quietly become resistance. That is where chapter 1 begins. Before we continue, if something in these opening minutes has already made you think differently, take a second and subscribe to Mindflow Studio. Not because subscribing is a favor to us, but because the ideas we explore here are meant to be returned to stoicism, psychology, philosophy, discipline, and the deeper principles behind a stronger mind. There's far more coming, and I would rather you not ever find this channel twice. Subscribe now, stay with us through the 5 habits, and when this audiobook ends, choose one idea and actually live it, because knowledge becomes valuable only when it follows you beyond the moment you heard it. Now, let's begin with the first Stoic habit. Chapter 1. Why chasing creates resistance. There's an assumption buried deep inside the way most of us think about achievement. It sounds so reasonable that we rarely question it. If effort produces results, more effort should always produce better results. Work harder. Try again. Send another message. Make another adjustment. Stay another hour. Push a little further. Think about it a little longer. If the door has not opened, knock harder. If the answer has not arrived, do more. If the relationship feels uncertain, give more. If the project is struggling, interfere more. If success is taking too long, increase the pressure. Sometimes this works. That is precisely why the idea is so convincing. There are areas of life where additional effort produces additional output. Carry 1 box and you have moved 1 box. Carry 10 and you have moved 10. Practice a skill deliberately and within reasonable limits. Competence tends to improve. Write another page and the manuscript becomes 1 page longer. But human life contains another category of problems. Problems in which additional force eventually stops helping, and then, almost imperceptibly, begins interfering. A pianist can practice a difficult passage until the movement becomes more precise. But during a performance, she can become so determined not to make a mistake that she begins consciously controlling movements her trained body already knows how to perform. Her fingers tighten. Her attention turns inward. The music becomes mechanical. The desire to perform perfectly begins interfering with performance. A man can prepare carefully for a job interview. He researches the organization. He rehearses his experience. He thinks through difficult questions. All of this is productive effort. Then he enters the room, needing the interviewers to like him. Now he monitors every expression on their faces. Was that answer good? Why did she look down? Did that joke work? Should I explain more? Do they think I am qualified? His attention, which should be available for the conversation, becomes divided between participating in the interview and monitoring himself participating in the interview. He is no longer simply answering questions. He is watching himself answer them. And that additional effort does not make him more present. It makes presence harder. A woman can care deeply about preserving a relationship. She can listen better. Communicate honestly. Take responsibility when she is wrong. Make time. Express affection. These are actions. Then uncertainty appears. The other person becomes quieter for a few days. She becomes afraid. So she asks whether everything is okay. He says yes. An hour later, the reassurance has worn off. She studies the last message. It seems shorter than usual. She asks again. She becomes more affectionate, more available, more accommodating. She tries to close every inch of emotional distance before she knows whether that distance means anything at all. What she calls love may still contain love, but fear has entered it, and fear changes the texture of attention. It turns care into surveillance, affection into reassurance seeking, communication into interrogation, presence into monitoring. The relationship has not necessarily created the pressure. Her attempt to eliminate uncertainty has. This is one of the first paradoxes of chasing. You can interfere with something precisely because it matters so much to you, not because you are careless, because you care, not because you are lazy, because you're trying too hard in a place where more force is no longer the appropriate tool. The difference between productive effort and compulsive pursuit is subtle. From the outside, they can look almost identical. Both people may work late. Both may be ambitious. Both may make sacrifices. Both may care deeply. Both may persist when others quit. But internally, They're living in completely different worlds. Productive effort asks, what does the work require from me? Compulsive pursuit asks, what else can I do to guarantee the result? That word matters. Guarantee, because there comes a point in nearly every meaningful pursuit where action reaches the border of uncertainty. You can prepare for the interview. You cannot decide who gets hired. You can create excellent work. You cannot order people to value it. You can build a business carefully. You cannot completely command the market. You can tell someone how you feel. You cannot manufacture their feelings in return. You can train intelligently. You cannot negotiate with every variable affecting your body. You can submit the manuscript. You cannot control the editor. You can publish the video. You cannot personally reach through millions of screens and make people click. At some point, your jurisdiction ends. The chaser cannot tolerate that border. So the mind attempts to cross it, not physically, psychologically. It worries, checks, predicts, rehearses, reinterprets, overcorrects, pushes. It tries to turn thought into control. And because thought feels active, the person mistakes mental activity for productive action. This creates one of the strangest forms of exhaustion, working on something that is no longer yours to work on. You've already sent the email, but you continue composing it in your head. You have already completed the interview, but you conduct it 12 more times while lying in bed. You have already published the work, but you refresh the numbers as though observation could alter them. You have already expressed your feelings, but you construct 10 possible meanings from the other person's silence. Your hands have stopped working. Your mind has not. That is psychological chasing. And this is why chasing cannot be measured simply by how hard someone works. A person can work 14 hours with extraordinary concentration and still be detached. Another person can spend an entire day doing almost nothing while chasing relentlessly. One is engaged in action. The other is engaged in internal pursuit. One is tired because they worked. The other is tired because they could not stop trying to control what work could not control. That distinction changes everything. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus began his Enchiridion with a deceptively simple distinction. Some things are up to us, and some things are not. The statement is ancient. The psychological problem is current. Much of human suffering occurs not because we cannot distinguish these categories intellectually, but because emotionally we refuse to accept the distinction. We know we cannot control another person's response, but we behave as though the perfect message might. We know we cannot guarantee success, but we behave as though enough anxiety might protect us from failure. We know we cannot control how everyone sees us, but we edit ourselves endlessly in an attempt to manage every interpretation. The mind keeps trying to purchase certainty with effort, and uncertainty keeps refusing the transaction. This is where productive effort can become excessive control. Control is useful where control is possible. If your writing is weak, improve it. If your preparation is inadequate, prepare. If your finances are disorganized, make a plan. If your communication is unclear, speak clearly. If your strategy is failing according to sufficient evidence, change it. Detachment is not an excuse for incompetence. But there is another question that must be asked. What are you doing after you have done what can reasonably be done? That is where chasing often reveals itself. Suppose a creator releases a piece of work. During the first hour, the response is disappointing, so she changes the title. 20 minutes later, she changes it again. Then the thumbnail, then the description. Then she wonders whether the topic was wrong. Perhaps the entire direction of her work is wrong. She begins researching a different niche. By evening, she has made 6 strategic decisions based on a few hours of incomplete information. She calls this optimization, but optimization requires data. What she is doing may be anxiety management. She is not responding to reliable evidence. She is responding to the discomfort of not yet knowing. That difference is enormous, because when discomfort becomes a signal for action, you start making changes not when reality requires them, but whenever uncertainty becomes emotionally difficult. You uproot seeds to check whether they're growing. You change plans before they have had time to produce information. You interrupt processes because waiting feels like helplessness, and then you never discover whether the original strategy would have worked. Premature intervention is one of the hidden costs of chasing. There are times when action is wisdom. There are also times when not interfering is part of the action. That is harder to learn. Think about sleep. Sleep is not usually improved by desperately trying to sleep. The command becomes part of the problem. I have to sleep. I need to sleep now. Why am I still awake? Tomorrow will be terrible. The person begins monitoring whether sleep is happening. But monitoring requires wakefulness. The mind is trying to supervise the disappearance of consciousness. The goal and the method begin fighting each other. Something similar happens with confidence. A person enters a room thinking, be confident. Don't look nervous. Stand correctly. Where should I put my hands? Am I speaking too quickly? Do I look awkward? Now attention is consumed by the performance of confidence. The person is not relating to the room. They are managing an image of themselves inside the room. Again, the attempt to force the state interferes with the state. Creativity behaves this way too. There is disciplined creative work. Sitting down consistently, learning the craft, revising, researching, producing. Then there is forcing inspiration. This must be brilliant. This must succeed. This must prove I am talented. This must perform better than the last one. Now the blank page is no longer a page. It is a courtroom. Every sentence is evidence. Every weak paragraph feels like a verdict. The writer is no longer discovering what can be written. The writer is defending an identity. This is why pressure can destroy the very capacities it is intended to intensify. When the outcome becomes psychologically overloaded, the task changes. You are no longer merely giving a presentation. You are proving that you are intelligent. You are no longer simply going on a date. You are proving that you are desirable. You are no longer building a business. You are proving that your life is going somewhere. You are no longer publishing something. You are proving that you matter. You are no longer trying to win. You are trying to escape what losing would make you feel. The visible goal may remain exactly the same, but the internal stakes have become enormous. And once the stakes become enormous, behavior changes. Performance psychologists have long studied what happens when attention becomes disrupted under pressure. Skills that normally operate fluidly can become awkward when a person starts consciously monitoring processes that usually function more automatically. The golfer starts thinking about each component of the swing. The speaker starts listening to every word while saying it. The musician begins supervising every movement. The person trying desperately to make a good impression starts evaluating every gesture. Attention turns back on itself. There is now a person performing, and another person inside the mind watching performance. Chasing often creates this split. You cannot simply be where you are because part of you is standing outside the moment asking, is this getting me what I want? That question follows you everywhere. During the conversation, during the work, during the date, during the presentation, during the quiet evening, during the holiday, during the achievement itself. And here's the cruel part. Even when you get what you wanted, the habit may remain. The chaser does not automatically become peaceful after receiving the object of the chase. Often, the chase simply changes direction. You finally get the relationship. Now you chase certainty that it will last. You finally get the money. Now you chase certainty that you will not lose it. You finally get recognition. Now you chase evidence that you are still relevant. You finally achieve the position. Now you chase proof that you deserve to be there. This reveals something important. Perhaps chasing was never entirely about obtaining. Perhaps it was an attempt to eliminate uncertainty. And no achievement can permanently do that. There is another form of resistance that appears between people. When you need a particular response from someone, communication changes. You may become less interested in discovering what is true, and more interested in producing the answer you need. You phrase things carefully. You over-explain. You soften every disagreement. You anticipate objections. You offer more than was requested. You monitor their face. You try to prevent disappointment before disappointment exists. The other person may not consciously know what is happening, but pressure has entered the interaction. There is now an invisible demand underneath the visible conversation. Please respond in a way that allows me to feel safe. This is why chasing can make relationships feel heavy. Not because caring is unattractive, not because people should play games or pretend to be unavailable, but because affection becomes difficult to receive freely when it arrives carrying an obligation. Love me so I can feel worthy. Reassure me so I can stop being afraid. Choose me so I can believe I am enough. Stay so I do not have to confront myself. The other person is no longer simply being asked to participate in a relationship. They are being asked to regulate an internal world. That is a burden no relationship can carry indefinitely. The same pattern appears professionally. A person desperately wants approval from a supervisor. So instead of presenting an idea clearly, they surround it with apologies. This may not be right, but I'm not sure if this makes sense. Maybe this is stupid. Sorry if I'm missing something. They believe they are protecting themselves from rejection, but they are weakening their own communication before anyone has rejected anything. Fear tries to reduce the risk of rejection and creates behavior that can reduce confidence in the person. Again, the strategy begins producing the very resistance it was designed to avoid. So how can you tell whether you are pursuing something or chasing it? Not by asking how badly you want it, not by counting the hours you work. Ask different questions. Can I stop for the day when today's useful work is complete? If not, what do I believe one more hour will protect me from? Can I tolerate a period in which there is no new information? Or does silence immediately create stories? When I check progress, am I gathering information for a decision or searching for relief? That question alone can reveal a great deal. Do I change strategy because the evidence changed or because my anxiety increased? Can I receive negative feedback without experiencing it as a judgment of my worth? Can I allow another person to have an emotional response I do not control? Can I rest without feeling that the goal is escaping from me? If the result takes twice as long as expected, can I remain intelligent or will I become frantic? And perhaps the most revealing question, if I knew for certain that worrying would not improve the outcome, what would I stop doing? Sit with that. Because much of what we call effort is not effort. It is ritual, mental ritual, checking ritual, reassurance ritual, control ritual. We perform it because doing nothing about uncertainty feels dangerous. The ritual gives us the sensation of involvement, but involvement and influence are not the same. You can be intensely involved in something you no longer have the ability to influence. That is chasing. There is a simple way to begin separating pursuit from chasing. Divide your goal into 3 territories. The first is action. What can I genuinely do? Make the call. Write the page. Train. Study. Apply. Prepare. Save. Speak. Publish. Apologize. Ask. Leave. Begin. The second territory is response. What happens after my action enters a world containing other people and variables? They answer. They don't. They accept. They reject. People buy. They scroll past. The experiment succeeds. It fails. The audience grows. It doesn't. The person reciprocates. They do not. The third territory is meaning. This is where chasing becomes most dangerous. What will I decide the response means about me? No reply becomes, I am unimportant. Rejection becomes, I am not good enough. Slow progress becomes, I am failing. Someone leaving becomes, I am unlovable. A bad month becomes, I will never succeed. This third territory is often where desire becomes suffering. The external event may hurt, but then the mind converts an event into an identity. And once identity is threatened, the chase intensifies. Now you are no longer pursuing the goal merely because you want it. You are pursuing it because you need to overturn a verdict. You need the next success to erase the previous failure. You need the next person to repair the previous rejection. You need the next achievement to silence the suspicion that you are falling behind. You need the numbers to rise so you can feel intelligent again. This is where effort becomes emotionally loaded. An emotionally loaded effort is difficult to regulate because stopping no longer feels like resting. It feels like surrendering your case. There is nothing wrong with wanting greatly. This book is not an argument for shrinking your ambitions until nothing can disappoint you. That is not detachment. That is avoidance. Build, compete, create, love, Ask, risk, attempt difficult things. Work extraordinarily hard when extraordinary work is required. But learn to recognize the moment when effort stops serving the task and begins serving fear. That moment may arrive at midnight when the work is already good enough, but you cannot stop editing. It may arrive after you send a message and feel compelled to send another. It may arrive when you check the same number for the 6th time in an hour. It may arrive when you receive useful criticism and immediately feel the need to defend yourself. It may arrive when a strategy needs time, but you cannot tolerate giving it time. It may arrive when another person asks for space, and every instinct tells you to close the distance. That is the moment to ask, what am I trying to accomplish right now? And then, can this action actually accomplish it? If the answer is no, you may not be acting anymore. You may be chasing. And chasing is exhausting because it asks action to perform an impossible job. It asks effort to guarantee outcomes. It asks thought to eliminate uncertainty. It asks achievement to establish permanent worth. It asks other people to create internal security. It asks tomorrow to make today feel safe. No amount of effort can satisfy those demands for long. That is why the answer is not simply to work less. Sometimes you should work more. Sometimes a courageous thing is another attempt, another application, another year of practice, another revision, another difficult conversation. Detachment does not prescribe the quantity of effort. It changes the quality of your relationship with effort. You stop asking effort to save you. You let it do what effort can actually do. Improve the probability. Develop the skill. Create the opportunity. Express the truth. Prepare you for the moment. Move you one step further. And then you allow reality to have its part. That is not weakness. It may be one of the hardest forms of strength, because forcing feels powerful. Waiting intelligently does not. Checking feels active. Trusting your completed work does not. Pushing feels courageous. Allowing someone else to choose does not. But sometimes maturity is the ability to remain still at the precise moment fear is demanding unnecessary movement. And now we reach the deeper problem. If chasing were merely a bad habit, it would be relatively easy to stop. Put down the phone. Stop refreshing. Take the evening off. Wait. But anyone who has tried this knows that the physical action is often the smallest part. You put the phone down, and the mind continues reaching for it. You decide not to check, and suddenly checking feels more urgent. You tell yourself to wait, and the silence becomes louder. Why? Because beneath chasing there is usually something more powerful than desire. Fear. Fear that the opportunity is disappearing. Fear that someone is losing interest. Fear that time is running out. Fear that other people are moving ahead. Fear that the work will fail. Fear that you chose incorrectly. Fear that you will regret not doing more. Fear that if this does not happen, something painful will become true about you. And that changes our understanding of resistance. Perhaps desire was never the enemy. Perhaps wanting deeply was never the problem. Perhaps ambition was never the problem. Perhaps love was never the problem. Perhaps the problem begins when fear attaches itself to desire and whispers, "You must have this." Not because it would be wonderful, not because it matters, not because you have chosen it, but because without it, you will not be okay. That is when pursuit becomes chasing. That is when effort becomes compulsion. That is when attention becomes surveillance. That is when patience becomes unbearable. That is when control begins reaching beyond its jurisdiction. And that is why resistance is often not created by desire itself, but by what fear adds to desire. In the next chapter, we have to enter that fear directly, because once desire stops saying, "I want this," and begins saying, "I need this," we are no longer dealing with ambition alone. We are dealing with desperation. Chapter 2, The Psychology of Desperation. Desire says, "I would deeply like this." Desperation says, "I need this to happen so I can finally be okay." The difference may be only a few words, but psychologically, they describe two entirely different worlds. Desire can tolerate reality. Desperation negotiates with it. Desire can hear no. Desperation hears a verdict. Desire allows you to pursue something while remaining larger than pursuit. Desperation slowly reduces your entire emotional life to one question: is it happening yet? And perhaps the most dangerous thing about desperation is that it rarely introduces itself by name. It calls it self-commitment. It calls it self-persistence. It calls it self-love. It calls it self-ambition. It calls itself being responsible. Sometimes it even calls it self-faith. But underneath all those respectable names is a quiet bargain. When I get this, then I will allow myself to be okay. Consider Daniel. For nearly a decade, Daniel has been building his career carefully. He is competent, disciplined, respected. Then an opportunity appears. A senior position opens inside his organization. The salary would be considerably higher. The title would matter. The position would place him among people he has quietly compared himself with for years. At first, Daniel simply wants a job. He updates his resume, studies the role, prepares examples of his accomplishments, practices difficult interview questions. So far, this is desire translated into useful action. Then something changes. A colleague tells him casually, "You would be perfect for that position." Another says, "It's probably your time." Daniel goes home that evening and begins thinking about what the promotion would mean. Not what he would do in the role. What it would mean. His parents would be proud. His friends would see that his years of work had amounted to something. People who underestimated him would have to reconsider. His salary would finally resemble the life he thought he should have by this age. He would no longer feel behind. And without realizing it, Daniel begins placing things inside this promotion that no employment contract could possibly contain. Respect, vindication, security, identity, proof. The job is no longer a job. It has become a psychological container. And now, Daniel does not merely want it. He needs it to tell him a story about himself. That is where desperation begins. Not necessarily when desire becomes intense, but when an outcome becomes responsible for repairing your relationship with yourself. The interview goes well. Daniel leaves the building relieved for perhaps 40 minutes. Then he remembers one answer. He should have phrased it differently. Why did the interviewer ask that follow-up question? Maybe she wasn't convinced. He reconstructs the conversation. He remembers one interviewer, smiling. Good sign. Another was taking notes. Was that good? He searches online for articles about signs an interview went well. Several reassure him. One does not. He reads that one twice. This is what psychologists call attentional narrowing. When something becomes emotionally important, attention begins organizing itself around a threat or opportunity. Normally, Daniel's world contains hundreds of things: work, friends, food, music, exercise, family, plans, books, conversations. But now his psychological world begins shrinking. There is a promotion and everything else. Desperation does this. It takes one part of life and makes it emotionally enormous. The more enormous it becomes, the more information related to it captures attention. A notification appears. His body reacts before he has even read it. Not the company. Relief. 10 minutes later, another notification. Again, the nervous system prepares. Not the company. Disappointment. Soon Daniel is checking his inbox manually, at first every hour, then every 30 minutes, then whenever he feels uncomfortable. Notice what has happened. Checking began as information gathering. Now it has become emotional regulation. Daniel is no longer opening his inbox merely to discover whether an email has arrived. He is opening it because uncertainty has become uncomfortable, and checking briefly relieves the discomfort. This is how reassurance seeking can become self-reinforcing. You feel uncertain. You check. For a moment, you feel that you have done something. Nothing has changed, but the act itself creates temporary relief. Then uncertainty returns. So you check again. And because checking temporarily reduces anxiety, the brain learns something. When uncertainty hurts, check. That lesson matters. Because every time Daniel obeys the urge, he may be teaching himself that uncertainty is something he cannot tolerate without performing a ritual. The behavior that appears to calm him in the short term can help preserve the cycle in the long term. That is why reassurance has such a strange appetite. It eats, and soon becomes hungry again. 3 days pass. Daniel receives no answer. Now ambiguity enters, and desperation is particularly bad at interpreting ambiguity. His manager walks past him and seems slightly distant. Daniel notices. Ordinarily, he might assume she is busy. Now, he wonders whether she knows something. A colleague, who also applied for the position, has a private meeting. Daniel notices that too. Maybe they are offering him the job. The hiring manager does not respond to Daniel's connection request. Another sign. A harmless delay becomes evidence. A neutral expression becomes information. Silence becomes communication. This is one of desperation's most consequential distortions. When the outcome feels essential, ambiguity begins to feel threatening. The mind dislikes uncertainty, but a desperate mind dislikes it even more, because uncertainty now concerns something connected to identity. If Daniel merely wanted a promotion, waiting would be uncomfortable. But because the promotion has become proof that his life is progressing correctly, waiting becomes psychologically dangerous. He is not waiting to discover who got a job. He is waiting to discover what the world thinks he is worth. Of course, the hiring decision cannot objectively determine that, but his nervous system does not care about the philosophical distinction. The meaning has already been assigned. This is where scarcity enters. Scarcity is not simply having too little. It can also be the perception that something important is limited and may disappear. There is only one position, one answer, one opportunity, one person, one chance. When the mind receives scarcity, the scarce object can consume disproportionate attention, and attention changes value. The more Daniel thinks about the promotion, the larger it becomes. The larger it becomes, the more frightening losing it feels. The more frightening losing it feels, the more he thinks about it. A loop forms. Attention creates importance. Importance creates fear. Fear creates more attention. This is rumination. Rumination often masquerades as problem solving because both involve thinking about a problem, but they are not the same. Problem solving moves. Rumination circles. Problem solving asks, "What can I do?" Rumination asks, "What does this mean? What if? Why? What if? What if?" Daniel is already interviewed. There is currently no useful action available. Yet his mind continues working. Not because there is more work to perform, but because the mind confuses continued thought with continued influence. We encountered this in the previous chapter. The hands have stopped, but psychologically, the chase continues. By day 5, Daniel decides to send an email. There is nothing wrong with following up after an interview. A professional follow-up can be entirely appropriate, but actions cannot be understood only by their appearance. We also have to ask what function they are serving. Daniel drafts, just checking whether there are any updates regarding the position, then deletes it. Too needy. He writes another. Too cold. Another. Too long. He searches for the ideal follow-up email. He finally sends one. For 10 minutes. He feels better. Then a new problem appears. Why haven't they responded? The email that was supposed to reduce uncertainty has created another object of uncertainty. Now Daniel is waiting for an answer to his attempt to get an answer. This is the architecture of desperation. It keeps creating secondary problems around the original uncertainty. Did I send the right message? Did I wait long enough? Did I wait too long? Should I follow up? Was the follow-up too eager? Should I clarify? Should I withdraw? Should I act like I don't care? Should I do more? Desperation produces activity. That is why it is so easy to mistake for commitment. But activity is not necessarily effective. Sometimes it is simply anxiety with a schedule. There is another force operating inside Daniel, loss aversion. Psychological research has repeatedly demonstrated that losses can exert disproportionate emotional force relative to comparable gains. And Daniel has already mentally possessed the promotion. He has pictured the salary, rearranged his future around it, felt the relief, quietly anticipated telling people. The position is not his, but psychologically, part of him has already claimed it. So not receiving it may no longer feel like failing to gain something. It may feel like having something taken away. This is important far beyond careers. Sometimes we suffer intensely over futures that never actually belong to us. A relationship we expected, a university admission, a business opportunity, a particular income, a life by a particular age. We mentally move into a future, decorate it, build our identity inside it, and then experience reality's refusal to provide it as eviction. The pain is real, but part of that pain comes from psychological ownership. We turn possibility into possession, then called its disappearance loss. Daniel begins behaving unlike himself. He becomes irritable. He cannot concentrate properly on his current job. Ironically, his desire for advancement is making him worse at the work directly in front of him. He checks the applicant's professional profile online. He compares qualifications. He remembers accomplishments he forgot to mention. At night, he constructs arguments for why he deserves a position, then arguments for why he probably will not get it, then rebuttals to those arguments. An intelligent mind can become extraordinarily sophisticated in the service of anxiety. This is why desperation should not be confused with stupidity. Intelligence does not necessarily protect us from distorted thinking. Sometimes it merely gives distorted thinking better vocabulary. A clever person can construct magnificent explanations for behavior that began as fear. They can call reassurance due diligence, call obsession focus, call inability to rest work ethic, call controlling another person fighting for the relationship, call constant monitoring being strategic. This is why self-awareness requires more than asking, "What am I doing?" You must ask, "What psychological need is this behavior serving?" Viktor Frankl understood something related to this paradox. Frankl did not teach that wanting things causes them to disappear, nor that the universe rewards attachment. His argument was more precise. In Man's Search for Meaning, he suggested that success and happiness are difficult to pursue directly. Happiness, in his account, tends to arise as an effect of devotion to a meaningful cause or another person, while success similarly emerges as a consequence rather than something that can simply be commanded. The insight matters because some human states become distorted when they are made objects of excessive self-monitoring. Ask constantly, "Am I happy yet?" And part of your attention is removed from whatever might actually absorb you enough for happiness to arise. Ask constantly, "Am I successful yet?" And life can become an endless measurement against a psychological scoreboard. Daniel has stopped inhabiting his career. He is measuring it. He has stopped asking what work deserves his attention. He is asking whether work is producing the identity he wants quickly enough. That distinction is subtle and devastating, because once life becomes evident for your worth, nothing can simply happen anymore. Everything becomes a score. There's a way to expose this. Take the thing you are chasing, the relationship, the promotion, the money, the acceptance, the audience, the degree, the opportunity, the answer. Then complete one sentence without polishing it. If this doesn't happen, it means underscore, 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 underscore about me. Do not answer what it means about circumstances. Answer what you fear it means about you. Daniel tries it. If I don't get this promotion, it means... He first writes, "There were stronger candidates." That is an explanation, not the hidden sentence. He tries again. It means my career is progressing slowly. Closer. Again. It means I am behind. There. But even that has another layer. If I am behind, what does that mean? Daniel waits, then writes, "It means I am not as successful as I thought I would be by now." And underneath that, it means maybe I am not as capable as I thought. There it is. The promotion was carrying far more than a salary. Daniel was asking a hiring committee to settle an argument he had been having with himself. That is why the decision felt enormous. And this exercise can be uncomfortable because the first answer is rarely the deepest one. If this person leaves, it means I wasn't enough. If this business fails, it means I am not capable. If they reject my work, it means I am not talented. If I don't earn this amount, it means I am falling behind. If nobody notices what I create, it means I am irrelevant. If they choose someone else, it means I am replaceable. If I fail after telling everyone what I plan to do, it means I will look foolish. Now the chase becomes easier to understand. You were not merely pursuing the visible object. You were trying to prevent the sentence in the blank from becoming true. And when a human being believes an outcome can prove or disprove something fundamental about their worth, rationality becomes expensive. The solution is not to pretend you do not care. Daniel cares. He wants a promotion. He is allowed to want it. Detachment does not require him to say, "I don't care whether I get it." That would be dishonest. Instead, he must separate two statements that desperation fuse together. "I deeply want this," and "I require this to be okay." The first can remain. The second must be examined, because no promotion can permanently prove Daniel's worth. If he receives it while retaining the underlying belief that achievement determines his value, relief will come, but the system will remain. Soon another level will appear, another salary, another title, another comparison, another person ahead of him, and the same insecurity will simply acquire a more expensive target. That is one of the great traps of desperation. Sometimes getting what you desperately wanted does not cure desperation. It teaches desperation that it works. The mind concludes, "Yes, that achievement saved me. Now find the next one." And so the person spends a lifetime chasing psychological safety through external acquisition. A week after the interview, Daniel's phone rings. The hiring manager. His heart accelerates. For a moment, the entire world becomes that voice. Whatever happens next will matter. He does not have to deny that. But before answering, something becomes clear. The real danger was never simply losing the promotion. It was everything he had attached to losing it. The humiliation, the comparison, the imagined judgment, the fear of being ordinary, the suspicion that time was passing, the possibility that he had misjudged himself. That is what he had been running from. And perhaps this is why desperation feels so much stronger than ordinary desire. Desire moves toward something. Desperation is often doing two things simultaneously. It is moving toward what it wants while running away from what it fears. And the second force may be stronger. So when you find yourself checking, forcing, overthinking, seeking reassurance, changing strategies prematurely, reading meaning into silence, unable to concentrate on anything else, do not immediately accuse yourself of weakness. Ask the better question. What am I afraid this outcome will take from me? Because underneath desperation, we often discover something more fundamental than desire. We discover anticipated loss, loss of status, loss of certainty, loss of identity, loss of belonging, loss of opportunity, loss of a future we had already begun to call ours. And sometimes the fear is not even that we will lose the thing itself. It is that losing it will reveal something unbearable about us. That is where we must go next, because there is a peculiar psychological trap hidden inside attachment. The more terrified you become of losing something, the less freely you can hold it. And perhaps even more importantly, the less freely you can live while you have it. That brings us to the next question. What happens when you finally receive the thing you desperately wanted, but immediately become afraid that it can be taken away? Because getting something and being free enough to have it are not the same thing. Chapter 3. You cannot receive what you are terrified to lose. There is a strange way fear can ruin possession, not by taking something away, but by making you unable to experience it while it is still there. You get the relationship and begin fearing the breakup. You get the money and begin fearing the loss. You get the promotion and begin fearing exposure. You receive praise and begin wondering when people will stop admiring you. You become attractive and begin measuring every sign of aging. You finally achieve what you wanted, and instead of resting inside the achievement, you begin protecting it. That is the contradiction. The mind says, "I wanted this because I believed having it would make me feel secure." Then, once it arrives, now I am afraid because I have something to lose. The object changed. The fear survived. This is why acquisition does not automatically produce freedom. Sometimes it produces a more sophisticated form of anxiety. Before the relationship, you feared loneliness. Inside the relationship, you fear abandonment. Before the money, you feared scarcity. After the money, you fear losing status, lifestyle, control. Before success, you feared irrelevance. After success, you fear decline. Before recognition, you fear being unseen. After recognition, you fear being forgotten. Before beauty became important, you want approval. After approval arrives, you begin monitoring whether it will remain. This is a trap. The mind believes possession will end fear, but possession can simply give fear a new object. And if you do not understand this, you can spend years chasing safety through accumulation, more reassurance, more money, more proof, more attention, more control, more certainty. But if the underlying relationship with loss does not change, more possession simply means more territory to defend. Healthy attachment is not the enemy. Human beings form bonds. We care. We depend on one another in appropriate ways. We love people. We grieve when we lose them. We invest in work. We protect what matters. There is nothing psychologically mature about pretending to be untouched by loss. But attachment becomes distorted when another person, achievement, possession, or status becomes responsible for stabilizing the entire self. Then care begins changing shape. Love becomes surveillance. Success becomes identity. Money becomes proof. Approval becomes oxygen. Possession becomes fear. This is where the relationship with the thing becomes heavier than the thing itself. Eric Fromm wrote extensively about the difference between having and being. The distinction is useful here. When a person organizes life around having, the world becomes something to possess, secure, defend, and accumulate. When life is organized more around being, value is experienced through participation, aliveness, relationship, and activity itself. The point is not to reject possessions. The point is to notice when possession becomes the primary structure through which security is sought. Because anything you can possess, you can lose. And if your psychological stability depends on possession, fear is built into the arrangement. Consider love. A person enters a relationship after years of longing for one. At first, there is gratitude. Then attachment begins asking questions. Does this person still feel the same? Why did they take longer to reply? Why did they seem distracted? Why did they spend less time with me this week? Again, some concern may be reasonable. Relationships require attention, but fear has a way of turning observation into monitoring, monitoring into interpretation, interpretation into control. Now the person begins trying to secure the relationship. More messages, more reassurance, more questions, more attempts to prevent distance. And here's the paradox. The harder someone tries to eliminate the possibility of abandonment, the more pressure can enter the relationship. The fear of losing love can make love less free, because affection begins arriving with an invisible demand. Please prove that I am safe. Please prove that you will stay. Please prove that I matter. Please prove that this will not end. Another human being can offer love. They cannot offer permanent immunity from uncertainty. And when we ask them to do so, we place an impossible burden on the relationship. Money behaves differently, but the psychological structure can be similar. Someone grows up with financial insecurity. For years, they tell themselves, when I finally have enough, I will relax. Then they earn more. At first, relief. Then the standard changes. Enough becomes more. Expenses rise. Status enters. Savings become something to monitor. Investments fluctuate. Now the question is no longer, can I survive? It becomes, can I preserve everything I have built? The fear that once surrounded poverty can migrate into wealth. This does not mean money is irrelevant to security. Material resources matter enormously. Financial instability has real consequences. But psychological security and financial security are not identical. A person can be financially secure and psychologically unable to feel secure. That distinction matters. Because without it, a person may keep increasing the number while never reaching the state they thought the number would produce. The same pattern appears in status. Before recognition, why does nobody notice me? After recognition, what if they stop? Before promotion, I need to prove myself. After promotion, what if they discover I am not good enough? Before success, I want to reach the top. After success, What if I fall? Achievement can become strangely fragile when identity is fused with it, because then failure is not simply an event. It becomes self-loss. If I am successful and success disappears, who am I? That question explains why some people cling so tightly to roles, titles, reputations, and visible markers of importance. They are not protecting only a position. They are protecting the self-story attached to the position. And self-stories can be much harder to surrender than jobs. Beauty creates another version of the same problem. When appearance becomes a major source of approval, beauty can stop being something enjoyed and become something monitored. A line appears. A photograph looks different. Someone younger enters a room. A compliment does not come. The body is no longer simply lived in. It becomes evaluated, protected, compared, measured against time. And time always wins. The tragedy is not aging. The tragedy is spending youth terrified of losing youth. That is what fear does. It brings the future loss into the present and makes you pay emotionally before anything has even happened. This is one of the most important ideas in this chapter. Fear of loss is a way of suffering in advance. You have the person, but begin grieving the possibility of losing them. You have the money, but rehearse collapse. You have the position, but live inside fear of replacement. You have the health, but monitor every sensation. You have the praise, but anticipate criticism. You have the moment, but cannot fully enter it because part of your attention is guarding the future. This is why fear can prevent you from receiving what you already have. Receiving requires presence. Fear lives ahead of the moment. The Stoics understood impermanence in a severe way. They repeatedly emphasize that external things are unstable and that wisdom depends partly on remembering this instability, rather than pretending possession is permanent. This can sound bleak when misunderstood, but the intention was not to make life cold. It was to reduce shock. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on change, mortality, and the temporary nature of status and circumstance. The lesson was not, do not love, do not enjoy, do not care. The lesson was closer to, do not confuse temporary possession with permanent entitlement. That distinction can deepen gratitude, because when permanence is no longer assumed, presence becomes more available. You can love someone without pretending they are guaranteed. You can enjoy success without treating it as a permanent identity. You can appreciate youth without demanding that time stop. You can value money without asking it to answer every existential fear. This is where non-attachment becomes more mature than indifference. Indifference says, I do not care. Non-attachment says, I care deeply, but I will not demand permanence from what is temporary. Buddhist traditions approach attachment from a different philosophical framework, but one insight is especially relevant here. Suffering intensifies when the mind clings to changing things as though they should not change. This does not mean human connection is wrong. It means grasping creates tension because reality is unstable. Everything living changes. Relationships change. Bodies change. Careers change. Circumstances change. Preferences change. Reputation changes. Even identity changes. Clinging is the attempt to freeze movement, and fear is often what clinging feels like from the inside. There's a devastating question worth asking. If you received everything you are chasing tomorrow, would your fear finally disappear, or would you simply acquire new things to be afraid of losing? Do not answer too quickly. If you got the relationship, would fear end, or would a new fear begin? If you got the money, would insecurity disappear, or would your definition of enough move? If everyone admired you, would you finally feel safe, or would you begin protecting the admiration? If you became successful, would you become free, or would you begin defending success? The question is not designed to make desire meaningless. It is designed to reveal whether you are asking an external outcome to perform an internal task cannot permanently complete. A practical exercise can help. Choose one thing you deeply value: a relationship, a career, money, a body, a reputation, a role. Then divide a page into 2 columns. At the top of the first, write appreciation. At the top of the second, possession. Under appreciation, write what you genuinely value. I appreciate this person's presence. I appreciate the work I get to do. I appreciate the security this money provides. I appreciate my health. I appreciate being recognized. Then, under possession, write what you are trying to control. I need this person to stay exactly the same. I need this role to keep proving my worth. I need this amount of money to never decrease. I need my appearance to remain unchanged. I need people to keep seeing me a certain way. Now, look at the difference. Appreciation tends to create presence. Possession tends to create monitoring. Appreciation says, "This matters to me." Possession says, "This must remain mine." Appreciation allows gratitude. Possession recruits fear. This does not mean you stop protecting what matters. It means you stop pretending that control can eliminate impermanence. And there is another hidden cost. When you are terrified of losing something, you can start changing yourself to keep it. You stop speaking honestly. You tolerate what you should challenge. You become overly agreeable. You hide needs. You perform. You avoid necessary risks. You shrink your life around what you are trying to preserve. Now the possession owns you. This can happen with relationships, with careers, with money, with status, with reputation, with approval. The thing you wanted because you believed it would expand your life begins reducing your freedom. That is not receiving. That is guarding. Real receiving contains a willingness to experience a thing while accepting that you cannot own time. This person is here, now. This success is here, now. This body is here, now. This opportunity is here, now. This season of life is here, now. And if you spend the present constantly checking whether the future will preserve it, you never fully receive the present. This is why detachment is not less love. Sometimes it is a condition that allows love to become cleaner. You stop gripping. You stop forcing. You stop turning gratitude into fear. You stop asking what you value to guarantee that it will never change. But fear rarely leaves quietly. Once the mind becomes afraid of losing something, it usually develops a strategy, a repetitive strategy. It begins looking for evidence. Is everything still okay? Do they still love me? Is the money still there? Are the numbers still rising? Do people still approve? Am I still attractive? Am I still winning? Is the future still safe? And so fear moves from possession into surveillance, from appreciation into measurement, from love into checking. That is where we go next. Because once the mind believes safety depends on an outcome remaining unchanged, it begins to monitor reality constantly for signs that something is slipping away. And the more it checks, the less safe it becomes. Chapter 4, Stop Checking for Evidence. There is a moment after you have done what you can, when action ends and checking begins. You send the message. 5 minutes later, you look at your phone. You publish the video. Then open the analytics. Refresh. Close them. Open them again. You submit the application. Check your inbox. Check the portal. Check your spam folder. Check the portal again. You start exercising. Step on the scale. You follow the plan for 3 days. Step on the scale again. You start a business. Check the sales dashboard before breakfast. Again at lunch. Again before bed. You begin repairing a relationship. Then study the other person's messages for evidence that something has changed. You start saving money. Check the balance. You begin learning something difficult. Then repeatedly ask yourself whether you are improving fast enough. The object changes, but the question underneath the behavior is often remarkably similar. Is it working yet? And beneath that question, another one. Can I relax yet? That second question is where checking becomes psychologically interesting. Because sometimes we are not checking for information. We are checking for permission to feel okay. Checking itself is not the problem. Measurement is one of humanity's most useful tools. Without measurement, there is no serious science, no meaningful experimentation, no reliable medicine, no financial accounting, no performance analysis, no way to distinguish what seems effective from what actually is. A scientist measures. A business owner measures. An athlete measures. A researcher measures. A creator measures. A person trying to change their behavior may need to measure, But there is an enormous difference between measurement and compulsive measurement. A scientist measures to obtain information. An anxious mind often measures to obtain emotional reassurance. Those two behaviors can look identical from the outside. Both people open the dashboard. Both people step on the scale. Both people check the data. Both people read the message. The difference is what happens internally. The scientist asks, "What does this information tell me?" The anxious mind asks, "Does this information allow me to feel safe?" And once measurement becomes responsible for emotional safety, you may discover that no measurement is enough. Return to Daniel from the previous chapters. He wanted the promotion. Then he began needing it. Then he became afraid of what losing it would mean. Now he is waiting. He has already interviewed. He has followed up appropriately. There is nothing useful to do. At 9:12 in the morning, he checks his email. Nothing. At 9:29. Again, nothing. At 10:03, his phone vibrates. Advertisement. At 10:17, he opens a recruitment portal. The status still says, "Under consideration." For a moment, Daniel feels better. Under consideration. Good. He has not been rejected. He returns to work. 27 minutes later, a thought appears. What if the portal updates before the email arrives? He checks again. Still under consideration. Relief. Temporary relief. That word matters. Temporary. Because if checking permanently resolved the uncertainty, Daniel would only need to check once. But the information he receives cannot answer the question he actually wants answered. He wants certainty about the future. The portal can only report the present. So the mind returns. Again and again. This is how reassurance seeking can form a loop. First comes uncertainty, then discomfort, then an urge to check, then checking, then brief relief, then uncertainty returns, then the urge returns. The cycle looks like this: uncertainty, discomfort, checking, relief, uncertainty, checking. And there's a trap hidden inside that relief. The relief can reward the checking behavior. If checking temporarily reduces discomfort, the brain learns that checking is useful whenever discomfort appears. Not necessarily useful for solving the actual problem, useful for changing how you feel. That distinction explains why the behavior can become repetitive. You are no longer checking because new information is likely. You are checking because uncertainty has become emotionally difficult to carry. This can happen in relationships with extraordinary subtlety. Someone you care about seems quieter than usual. You ask, "Are we okay?" They say yes. Relief. Later that evening, their message seems shorter. You read it twice, maybe 3 times. Something feels different. You ask another question. "Are you sure everything is okay?" They reassure you. Relief again. But notice what the mind may learn. Not, "I can tolerate uncertainty and allow the relationship to unfold." Instead, "When I become anxious, I need the other person to make the anxiety disappear." And soon reassurance itself becomes part of the relationship. Now the other person is no longer merely your partner. They are being recruited as the regulator of your uncertainty. Every delay needs interpretation. Every mood needs explanation. Every change in tone becomes evidence. The tragedy is that the person seeking reassurance may believe they are protecting the relationship, while gradually making the relationship carry the weight of their fear. This connects directly to the previous chapter. Fear of losing something produces surveillance, and surveillance rarely feels like surveillance when you are the one doing it. It feels like being careful. The same thing happens with progress. Suppose someone decides to improve their health. They create a reasonable plan. Then they weigh themselves every morning. The number falls. Excellent day. The number rises. Bad day. Falls again. Motivation. Rises again. Panic. Soon the scale is no longer simply measuring body mass. It is measuring mood. One number determines how disciplined the person feels, how attractive they feel, whether yesterday was successful, whether the plan is working, perhaps even whether they respect themselves that morning. The measurement has acquired psychological authority far beyond what the data deserves. Daily fluctuations may reflect water, food intake, digestion, hormonal changes, sodium, timing, and other variables. But the anxious mind does not experience a number as noisy data. It experiences it as a verdict. This is measurement anxiety. The metric stops serving the goal, and the person begins serving the metric. Creators know another version. You publish something. For a while, the work belonged to you. You chose the idea, made the thing, edited it, released it. Then numbers appear. 11 views, 37, 82. The number rises. You refresh, 114. Refresh, 121. Then it slows. Now, the mind begins constructing explanations. Wrong title, wrong thumbnail, wrong subject, wrong upload time. Maybe the audience hates it. Maybe the platform stopped recommending it. Maybe you should change something. So you change the title, then check. Change the thumbnail. Check. Adjust something else. Check again. There may be legitimate reasons to optimize creative work based on performance data, but the question is whether enough evidence exists. That is where compulsive checking can become more than emotionally exhausting. It can become strategically destructive, because excessive monitoring creates pressure to respond to noise as though it were signal. This is one of the least discussed costs of chasing. It destroys patience with your own experiments. You plan a strategy on Monday, dig it up on Wednesday to see whether roots have formed, then plant something else on Thursday. Not because the original strategy failed, because uncertainty became unbearable before sufficient evidence accumulated. People do this with businesses, careers, content, investments, study methods, exercise, relationships, personal habits. They make a decision, monitor it intensely, experience ordinary ambiguity, become anxious, and intervene prematurely. Then, because they intervened, they never learn whether the original approach would have worked. Their anxiety contaminates their experiment. A researcher would recognize the problem immediately. If you repeatedly alter experimental conditions before enough observations have accumulated, interpretation becomes difficult. What caused the result? The original treatment? The modification? The timing? Random variation? You no longer know. Yet people conduct their lives this way constantly. They change strategy because nothing happened for 5 days. They abandon a project because the first response was weak. They change communication style because someone seemed distant once. They rewrite the plan because progress temporarily plateaued. They assume absence of visible movement means absence of movement. This is where patience becomes more than a virtue. It becomes an epistemological skill. Patience allows reality enough time to give you meaningful information. William James wrote extensively about attention and the role it plays in experience. One of the broader insights we can take from his work is that what repeatedly occupies attention becomes disproportionately important in consciousness. This matters enormously for checking. Every time you check, you are not merely collecting information. You are also returning attention to the object again, again, again. And repeated attention can make the object feel increasingly central. This is why checking can create a peculiar illusion. The more uncertain you feel, the more you check. And the more you check, the larger the uncertainty becomes in your mental world. You thought you were checking because the thing mattered. Sometimes the thing begins mattering even more because you keep checking. Attention feeds importance. Importance increases vigilance. Vigilance feeds attention. Another loop. There's also a deeper misunderstanding involved. We often assume that watching something gives us influence over it, but monitoring and controlling are not the same. You can refresh an inbox without causing a reply. You can watch analytics without creating another view. You can check an application portal without changing the decision. You can inspect an investment without controlling the market. You can analyze someone's online activity without discovering what they truly feel. You can step on a scale repeatedly without causing the underlying biological process to accelerate. Checking creates activity, and activity can create the sensation of agency. But sensation is not control. Sometimes the bravest action available is to recognize there's currently nothing useful for me to do. That sentence can be surprisingly difficult because doing nothing useful feels dangerously similar to doing nothing at all. They are not the same. Waiting can be part of intelligent action. This is where detachment becomes practical, not mystical, not passive, practical. You decide in advance when information deserves your attention. Instead of allowing anxiety to determine the checking interval, reason determines it. Call this an evidence fast. Choose one metric you currently monitor more often than necessary. Only one. Your inbox, your sales, your views, your weight, your application status, your bank balance, your investment, a person's online activity, your ranking, whatever repeatedly pulls you back. Now ask 3 questions. First, how quickly can this information meaningfully change? If meaningful change takes days, checking every 15 minutes is not information gathering. Second, if the number changes right now, is there an action I should immediately take? If the answer is no, frequent monitoring may have little practical value. Third, what checking interval would I choose if I were calm? Not indifferent. Calm, perhaps once each evening, once every 48 hours, once a week, at a predetermined review meeting. Whatever makes sense for the metric, then establish the interval. Until that time, do not check, not because checking is forbidden, because you have already decided when checking becomes useful. At first, something uncomfortable may happen. Your hand will still reach for the phone. The thought will still appear. Maybe something changed. Maybe I should look. Maybe just once. This is the real exercise. The evidence fast is not primarily training you to avoid a dashboard. It is training you to experience an unanswered question without immediately anesthetizing it with information. That is uncertainty tolerance. You feel the urge and discover that an urge does not require obedience. You wonder and remain capable of working. You do not know and remain intact. That is a quiet form of freedom. Eventually, Daniel tries it. He chooses 2 times. Once at midday, once near the end of the workday. No recruitment portal between those times. No inbox refreshing. The first morning is uncomfortable. At 9:37, he wants to check. He doesn't. At 10:11, again, he notices something important. The urge rises, stays, then weakens. Nothing terrible happens. By 11 o'clock, he has completed work that would normally have been interrupted several times. At midday, he checks. Nothing. There is disappointment, but it is clean disappointment. Not 3 hours of anticipation punctuated by 20 small disappointments. This distinction is enormous. Compulsive checking does not necessarily protect you from bad news. Sometimes it simply allows you to experience the possibility of bad news dozens of times before the news exists. And gradually, Daniel begins recovering something he did not know he had surrendered. Attention. His attention had become collateral for an outcome he could not control. Now he is taking it back. This is one of the deepest forms of detachment, not withdrawing effort from what matters, but withdrawing unnecessary attention from what cannot currently be influenced. You can care without staring. You can wait without monitoring. You can work without repeatedly demanding proof that the work will succeed. You can love without conducting emotional inspections. You can pursue progress without asking progress to introduce itself every morning. There will still be moments when measurement is necessary. Measure, learn, adjust. A rational person does not reject evidence. Detachment is not blindness, but collect evidence at intervals appropriate to the process, not intervals dictated by fear. A farmer does not pull a seed from the soil every morning to verify germination. A researcher does not rewrite the hypothesis after every observation. A thoughtful investor does not necessarily redesign a long-term strategy because of every movement. A meaningful relationship cannot be judged from every text message. A life cannot be evaluated every evening as though it were a quarterly report. Some processes reveal themselves slowly, and your demand for immediate evidence does not make them faster. It only makes you more impatient. So when the urge appears, is it working yet? Ask another question. Do I need information right now? Or do I need reassurance? If you need information, measure. If you need reassurance, notice the uncertainty. Let it exist. Return to what is yours to do. Because perhaps the next stage of detachment begins when you stop requiring reality to constantly report its progress to you. You did the work. You sent the application. You planted the seed. You published the work. You had the conversation. You made the decision. You took the action. Now, there may be a period in which nothing visible happens. That period is not necessarily failure. It is simply the part of reality that does not obey your preferred timetable. And learning to live there between effort and evidence may be one of the most important psychological skills you ever develop. Because some things need to be measured, but they do not need to be watched while they grow. Chapter 5, Detachment is not giving up. If I stop chasing, won't I become lazy? It is a reasonable objection. In fact, it may be the most important objection in this entire book. Because if everything we have said about detachment is misunderstood, a person could use it to justify almost anything. They could stop applying for opportunities and call it detachment. Stop having difficult conversations and call it surrender. Abandon a project when it becomes uncomfortable and call it letting go. Avoid disciplined work and call it trusting the process. Fail to prepare, then claim they are unattached to the result. That is not detachment. That is avoidance wearing philosophical clothing. And the distinction matters. Because the purpose of detachment is not to make you care less about your life. It is to make you more capable of acting intelligently in the parts of life where caring deeply does not guarantee control. Consider the strange position in which every ambitious person eventually finds themselves. You can control whether you prepare for the interview. You cannot control whether they choose you. You can control whether you write the book. You cannot control whether thousands of people read it. You can control whether you communicate honestly in a relationship. You cannot control whether another person stays. You can control whether you conduct rigorous research. You cannot command the experiment to produce the result you hope for. You can train for months, but you cannot negotiate with a stopwatch on race day. You can build a company carefully, but you cannot force the market to care. This is not pessimism. It is the architecture of action. Human beings act inside systems containing other people, chance, timing, biology, institutions, competition, history, and circumstances they did not create. The mistake is not wanting outcomes. The mistake is confusing responsibility for our contribution with control over the final result. And once those become confused, effort becomes psychologically dangerous, because now every outcome feels personal. The Stoics understood this problem with unusual clarity. Epictetus begins the Enchiridion by distinguishing between things that are up to us and things that are not. Our judgments, intentions, and choices belong much more directly to us. Many external outcomes do not. This idea is sometimes flattened into a slogan. Only focus on what you can control. But life is more complicated than that. We routinely need to care about things we cannot control. A physician cares whether the patient recovers. A researcher cares whether the experiment succeeds. A parent cares what happens to a child. An entrepreneur cares whether the business survives. An athlete cares whether they win. A person in love cares whether the relationship lasts. Detachment does not require pretending otherwise. The more useful question is, what kind of responsibility can I reasonably take for an outcome that I cannot completely control? That is where detachment becomes serious. Let us make several distinctions. Detachment is not indifference. Indifference says, I don't care what happens. Detachment says, I care deeply, but my psychological stability will not be held hostage by what happens. Acceptance is not resignation. Resignation says, there is nothing I can do. Acceptance says, this is what is true right now. What can I intelligently do from here? Patience is not procrastination. Procrastination postpones necessary action. Patience refuses unnecessary action. One delays what should be done. The other refuses to interfere simply because waiting feels uncomfortable. Surrender is not helplessness. Helplessness says, I have no agency. Healthy surrender says, my agency is boundaries. And non-attachment is not lack of ambition. You may have enormous ambitions. Without requiring every ambition to become reality before you permit yourself to respect the person pursuing them, These distinctions transform the entire meaning of letting go. You are not letting go of effort. You are letting go of the demand that effort must purchase certainty. This is easier to understand in elite performance. Consider an athlete before an important competition. Months or years of preparation may have led to one afternoon. Training, nutrition, recovery, technique, strategy, sleep, repetition, analysis. The athlete should take these things seriously, extremely seriously. Detachment does not mean training casually, because the outcome doesn't matter. That would be absurd. But eventually the competition begins, and something changes. At that point, excessive concern about the result can interfere with the very abilities required to produce it. The athlete begins monitoring themselves. Am I winning? Am I fast enough? What if I lose? What will everyone think? What if all this training was wasted? Now attention that should be directed toward execution is being consumed by evaluation. The performer is simultaneously performing and watching themselves perform. This is one reason pressure can disrupt skill behavior. A task that has been trained until it becomes fluid can become awkward when consciousness begins micromanaging every component. The athlete does not need less commitment. They need a different location for commitment. Before performance, commitment belongs heavily to preparation. During performance, commitment belongs to execution. After performance, commitment belongs to evaluation and learning. At no stage does anxiety about reputation improve the movement itself. Creative work has the same structure. A writer sits down. There are two possible psychological tasks. The first, write the strongest page possible. The second, write a page that proves I am talented. Those tasks look similar, but they produce very different internal environments. The first directs attention toward the work. The second divides attention between the work and the self. Now, every bad sentence becomes evidence. Maybe I am not good enough. Every difficult paragraph becomes threatening. Maybe I have lost it. Every comparison becomes personal. Someone else is doing better. The work has become a courtroom, and every paragraph is being asked to testify about the writer's worth. Detachment removes that burden. The sentence does not need to prove who you are. It only needs to become a better sentence. That is not reduced ambition. It may be the condition that allows ambition to become cleaner. Research offers an even sharper example. A serious scientist may desperately hope that a hypothesis is correct, but the scientist's responsibility is not to make the hypothesis correct. The responsibility is to design the experiment well, collect reliable observations, analyze them appropriately, interpret them honestly, report what the evidence supports. If the scientist becomes attached to a particular outcome, something dangerous can happen. Ambition can begin corrupting observation. Ambiguous findings become convenient findings. Unexpected data become annoying obstacles. Analysis becomes a search for confirmation rather than truth. The researcher becomes loyal to the desired conclusion instead of loyal to the investigation. Here, detachment is not passive. It is intellectual discipline. The detached researcher can work intensely precisely because the ego has less authority over what the evidence is allowed to say. That gives us a deeper principle. Sometimes detachment does not decrease commitment. It purifies commitment. You become committed to doing the work, well, rather than forcing the work to confirm your identity. Entrepreneurship exposes the same tension. A founder can work 12-hour days without chasing. Another person can spend 3 hours working and 15 hours psychologically chasing. The difference is not the number of hours. One person asks, what does the customer need? What does the evidence show? What can we improve? What assumptions should we test? The other asks, why hasn't this happened yet? Why aren't people noticing me? What if this fails? Should I change everything? Should I launch something else? Maybe I chose the wrong market. Maybe I am behind. Maybe everyone else knows something I don't. The first person is working on the business. The second person may technically be working on the business too, but psychologically, they are working on their fear, and fear has an endless task list. This leads us to a useful operating principle. Maximum responsibility for the action, minimum dependence on the result. Read that carefully. Maximum responsibility for the action, prepare thoroughly, practice, study, show up, ask, negotiate, apply, publish, train, save, learn, apologize, revise, follow up when follow-up is appropriate. Change strategy when evidence justifies changing strategy. Do not use detachment as permission for mediocrity. Do not sit beside an unopened book and claim to be detached from the examination result. Do not submit careless work and call yourself surrendered. Do not neglect a relationship and then announce that what is meant for you will stay. Do not refuse to make the phone call because rejection frightens you, and rename the fear peace. Detachment without responsibility quickly becomes self-deception. But then comes the second half. Minimum dependence on the result. This means the result can matter enormously without being given authority to define your entire worth. You can lose and remain someone capable of learning. You can be rejected and remain someone capable of loving. You can fail and remain someone capable of trying intelligently again. You can be overlooked without becoming invisible. You can be wrong without becoming worthless. That is what psychological independence from an outcome begins to look like. But even this principle has limitations, because actions and outcomes cannot always be cleanly separated. If your strategy repeatedly fails, you cannot simply congratulate yourself for effort forever. Results contain information. Reality deserves a vote. A business that continually loses money cannot survive on good intentions. A student repeatedly failing an examination may need a different method. A relationship that repeatedly causes harm may require more than patience. A researcher whose methods produce unreliable data needs methodological correction. Detachment should not become immunity from feedback. The goal is not ignore outcomes. The goal is learn from outcomes without turning them into identity verdicts. That is far more difficult and far more useful. A practical way to do this is to divide a difficult goal into 3 territories. Not 2, 3. Control, influence, uncertainty. Start with control. These are actions directly available to you. If you want a job, this may include improving your application, preparing carefully, developing relevant skills, arriving on time, and communicating professionally. If you are creating something, it includes researching, writing, editing, improving presentation, and publishing. If you are repairing a relationship, it includes honesty, listening, boundaries, accountability, and your own behavior. These belong substantially to you. Write them down. Be demanding here. This is where discipline belongs. Then comes influence. This category is important because real life is not divided neatly between I control it and I have absolutely nothing to do with it. You cannot control whether someone hires you, but you may influence a decision through preparation and experience. You cannot control how an audience responds, but you can influence response through quality, relevance, and presentation. You cannot control another person's feelings, but your behavior can influence the environment in which the relationship exists. Influence requires humility. You act, but you do not command. You contribute, but other variables contribute too. You persuade, but another person retains agency. This middle category prevents the philosophy of control from becoming simplistic. Finally, uncertainty. This includes what cannot currently be known or commanded: timing, competition, other people's private decisions, unexpected events, market shifts, whether an opportunity appears, how quickly an audience grows, whether another person changes, whether the experiment behaves exactly as predicted, whether luck enters the story. This is where chasing loves to live, because uncertainty offers a mind an infinite amount of material. What if? Maybe. Perhaps. Soon. Never. Why not yet? The detached person does not solve uncertainty. They locate it. That matters. Because once something has been correctly placed in the category of uncertainty, you can stop treating it as an unfinished personal task. Try this with something you want badly. Take a page. Write 3 headings: control, influence, uncertainty. Be precise. Then inspect where most of your emotional energy currently goes. You may discover something uncomfortable. Many people spend too little energy on control and enormous amounts on uncertainty. They neglect the application, then worry about acceptance. neglect the craft, then monitor recognition, avoid the conversation, then analyze the relationship, ignore their finances, then fear the future. Or they work responsibly, but continue spending the rest of the day mentally negotiating with variables no amount of thought can control. Detachment reverses that allocation. Give your best energy to control, your intelligent effort to influence, and your willingness to live without guarantees to uncertainty. There's another place where this becomes particularly difficult: love, because relationships involve two centers of freedom. You can love someone extraordinarily well and still not own their response. This can feel unbearable. So people attempt to convert influence into control. More messages, more explanations, more reassurance, more persuasion, more monitoring, more sacrifices designed secretly to create obligation. But love that becomes a strategy for controlling another person's freedom eventually stops feeling like love to the person receiving it. Eric Fromm argued that mature love involves active concern, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. The word respect matters here. To respect another person is partly to recognize that they exist beyond your wishes. You can offer love. You cannot manufacture reciprocation. You can communicate. You cannot force understanding. You can become trustworthy. You cannot force trust. You can invite closeness. You cannot imprison closeness without destroying it. So detachment in love does not mean, I don't need anyone. That can simply be another defense. It means, I can love you without making your freedom my enemy. Perhaps this is why detachment often looks paradoxically powerful. It returns energy to the place where energy can actually operate. Instead of spending 10 units of energy acting and 90 units fearing the result, you act, then act again where appropriate. Then wait, observe, learn, adjust, and continue living. Your life does not stand outside the locked door of one outcome. But there is still a deeper problem. Suppose you understand everything in this chapter. You understand control, influence, uncertainty. You understand why compulsive checking does not help. You understand why chasing can impair judgment. And yet, you still cannot let go. Why? Because sometimes attachment to an outcome is not really attachment to the outcome. It is attachment to what the outcome would prove. The promotion would prove you are important. The money would prove you succeeded. The relationship would prove you are lovable. The audience would prove you matter. The degree would prove you are intelligent. The body would prove you are attractive. The recognition would prove that all those years were worth something. Now we have reached something deeper than behavior. Because if achievement has been assigned the task of proving your worth, detachment will feel dangerous. Letting go will feel like abandoning the trial before the verdict arrives. So perhaps the question is no longer simply, how do I stop chasing? Perhaps it is, who would I be if I stopped requiring the thing I want to tell me what I am worth? That question changes everything. Because perhaps detachment becomes much easier when achievement is allowed to be an achievement. Love is allowed to be love. Money is allowed to be money. Success is allowed to be success. Without any of them being forced to answer the oldest and most exhausting question inside us. Am I enough? And that is where we must go next. Chapter 6. The identity of someone who already has enough. There is a question hiding beneath almost every ambitious life. It rarely announces itself directly. It disguises itself as discipline, as competition, as productivity, as the need to improve, as the desire to be admired, as another qualification, another promotion, another achievement, another person whose approval finally seems important enough to settle the matter. But underneath all of these things, the question can be painfully simple. When will I finally be enough? Not successful enough, not wealthy enough, not attractive enough, not accomplished enough, just enough. And if that question remains unanswered internally, the world will happily provide an endless series of examinations. Every room becomes a test. Every rejection becomes evidence. Every achievement becomes temporary relief. Every comparison becomes a threat. Every person who does not choose you becomes a witness for prosecution. Every person who surpasses you seems to have taken something from you. And success itself becomes strangely unsatisfying. Because the moment you achieve the thing that was supposed to prove your worth, another requirement appears. This is where detachment stops being merely a strategy for dealing with outcomes. It becomes a question of identity. Consider two people pursuing exactly the same goal. Both want to succeed. Both wake early. Both work hard. Both sacrifice. Both experience setbacks. Both are ambitious. From the outside, their lives might look almost identical, but internally, they're doing two completely different things. The first person says, I want to succeed. The second says, I need success to prove I am somebody. That difference can remain invisible for years, until something goes wrong. The first person experiences failure as information, painful information, perhaps expensive information, embarrassing information, but information nonetheless. Something did not work. A strategy failed. A decision was poor. The competition was stronger. The timing was wrong. More preparation is necessary. Something can be learned. The second person experiences the same failure differently. Something did not work. Therefore, something is wrong with me. The project failed. Therefore, I am a failure. They rejected my application. Therefore, I am inadequate. They left. Therefore, I was not worth staying for. Nobody noticed the work. Therefore, perhaps I am not important. The event has crossed a psychological border. It is no longer merely something that happened. It has become something that defines. Psychologists sometimes describe self-esteem as contingent when a person's sense of worth depends heavily upon meeting particular standards or receiving particular forms of validation. The contingency may be achievement, appearance, approval, academic performance, money, status, romantic acceptance, professional recognition, being needed, being admired, even being perceived as intelligent. The problem is not that any of these things matter. Of course they matter. The problem begins when they are assigned a second job. A career is no longer simply a career. It must prove that you matter. Money is no longer simply money. It must prove that you succeeded. Beauty is no longer simply beauty. It must prove that you deserve attention. A relationship is no longer simply a relationship. It must prove that you are lovable. Achievement is no longer simply achievement. It must settle an argument you have been having with yourself. And this is an impossible burden to place upon an outcome, because outcomes change. Careers end. Bodies age. Markets collapse. People leave. Awards are forgotten. Someone younger eventually enters the room. Someone more talented eventually appears. Someone earns more. Someone publishes more. Someone receives the opportunity you wanted. If identity has been built entirely from comparative evidence, then another person's success can feel like an attack on your existence. This is one of the hidden engines of status anxiety. You are not merely asking, how am I doing? You are asking, what does how I am doing say about who I am? William James was deeply interested in the relationship between the self and what a person considers mine. Our sense of self can extend far beyond the physical body. Reputation, possessions, relationships, achievements, social standing, the groups to which we belong, the things we can point toward and say, that is connected to me. There is nothing inherently pathological about this. Human identity is partly social. We do care how we are seen. We do derive meaning from roles. Parents, researcher, artist, leader, teacher, entrepreneur, partner, friend. But trouble begins when a role stops being something we do and becomes the only evidence that we are. Then losing the role feels like losing the self. This is why some people experience retirement as more than a change of schedule. Why losing a prestigious position can feel like social disappearance. Why the end of a relationship can produce the terrifying question, who am I without this person? Why failure after years of achievement can feel almost incomprehensible. The person has not merely lost something, they have lost a mirror. Carl Jung's work repeatedly returned to the danger of confusing the whole personality with the social face presented to the world, what he called the persona. The persona has a function. We need social identities, professional identities, roles, ways of presenting ourselves within society. But the role is not the entire person. You can be an excellent scientist without reducing yourself to your publication record. You can be successful without reducing yourself to your income. You can be loved without making another person's affection your only proof of lovability. You can be beautiful without turning beauty into the constitution of your identity. You can lose a competition without becoming a loser. This sounds obvious when stated abstractly, but watch what happens emotionally when one of those identities is threatened. That is where the real answer appears. Suppose someone says, "I don't care what people think." Perhaps, but criticism ruins their week. Suppose someone says, "Money doesn't define me." Perhaps, but they feel ashamed around people who earn more. Suppose someone says, "I know my worth." Perhaps, but one person's rejection sends them into days of obsessive analysis. Suppose someone says, "My career isn't everything." Perhaps, but when someone else is promoted, they experience the other person's advancement as their own diminishment. Our declared identity and our operational identity are not always the same. What we truly use to define ourselves often becomes visible when it is threatened. That gives us a difficult but useful question. What could someone take away from me that would make me feel like I had become less of a person? Your answer points toward the places where identity and outcome may have become fused. This is where the idea of enough must be rescued from another misunderstanding. Enough does not mean complacency. It does not mean telling yourself, "I have enough money, so I should never earn more. I know enough, so I should stop learning. I have achieved enough, so ambition is unnecessary. I am healthy enough, so discipline no longer matters. I am good enough, so criticism should be ignored." That is not what we mean. The distinction is much more precise. "I have enough, therefore I stop growing," is entirely different from "I am enough, therefore growth no longer has to rescue me." That is the center of this chapter. Read it again. "I am enough, therefore growth no longer has to rescue me." You can still want more. More knowledge, more money, more responsibility, more influence, more skill, a better relationship, a stronger body, a larger audience, a more meaningful career, a greater contribution. But the word more changes meaning. More is no longer medicine for an identity that feels defective. It becomes expansion rather than repair, expression rather than proof, creation rather than compensation. You are no longer climbing because the ground beneath you feels shameful. You are climbing because there is somewhere worth going. This creates a fascinating paradox. The person who does not need success to become somebody may become more capable of pursuing success. Why? Because failure becomes less psychologically expensive. Think about that. When every attempt threatens your identity, caution increases. You avoid experiments. You hide unfinished work. You become defensive about criticism. You prefer appearing competent to becoming competent. You choose goals that preserve your image. You procrastinate on meaningful work because beginning creates the possibility of discovering your limitations. Perfectionism enters. Not always because your standards are exceptionally high, but because your identity cannot afford ordinary imperfection. So you prepare forever, edit forever, research forever, wait forever. You call it high standards. Sometimes it is fear, because if the work is never released, the world never gets to judge it. But someone whose worth is not being negotiated through every result has another possibility. They can be wrong. They can ask a stupid question. They can publish something imperfect and improve the next one. They can hear criticism without automatically converting it into humiliation. They can enter a room where they are not the smartest person. They can admit, "I don't know." They can change their mind. They can fail publicly. They can begin again. This is not low self-esteem. It is psychological mobility. A fragile identity must constantly defend itself. A secure identity has enough room to learn. Ralph Waldo Emerson's writing on self-reliance is often reduced to a simplistic message of ignoring everyone and believing in yourself. His deeper concern was independence of judgment, the danger of allowing conformity and external approval to overpower one's own considered convictions. That idea matters here, because if your identity depends entirely on external confirmation, other people acquire extraordinary psychological authority over you. A stranger's opinion can alter your mood. A manager's decision can alter your sense of intelligence. An audience's response can alter your confidence. a romantic partner's attention, can alter your perception of your attractiveness. Numbers become emotional governors. Likes, views, income, rankings, followers, citations, sales, grades, metrics can describe something real. But when identity becomes contingent upon them, description becomes judgment. 10,000 views means I matter. 200 views means perhaps I don't. A promotion means they finally see my value. No promotion means maybe I don't have value. A return message means I am wanted. Silence means I am unwanted. Notice what has happened. External events are being asked to answer internal questions they were never designed to answer. So here's an exercise, not an affirmation, not pretending, not telling yourself that you already possess things you do not possess. Take a page and write, who am I without the outcome? Then complete these sentences honestly. If I do not get the thing I am currently pursuing, I am still someone who, if this person does not choose me, I am still someone who, if my work receives little recognition, I am still someone who, if someone surpasses me, I am still someone who, if I fail at this attempt, I am still someone capable of. Do not fill the blanks with empty praise. I am amazing. I am unstoppable. I am destined for greatness. Those statements may feel powerful for 10 seconds and change nothing. Use evidence-based identity. I am someone who keeps commitments. I am someone capable of learning. I am someone who can tolerate embarrassment. I am someone who can revise my methods. I am someone who treats people with dignity. I am someone willing to begin again. I am someone who can create without guaranteed applause. I am someone whose curiosity survives being wrong. I am someone capable of loving without ownership. I am someone who can experience disappointment without turning disappointment into identity. These identities remain available even when circumstances change. That is the point. Now go further. Write down the outcome you currently want most. Then ask, what am I secretly asking this outcome to prove about me? Do not rush. The first answer may be superficial. Money. No. What would the money prove? That I succeeded. And what would success prove? That I am capable. And what would being capable prove? That I was not foolish to believe in myself. Go deeper. A relationship. What would it prove? That someone chose me. And what would being chosen prove? That I am desirable. And what would desirability prove? That I am worthy of love. Go deeper. Recognition. What would recognition prove? That people finally see me. And what would being seen prove? That my life matters. There it is. The outcome is often carrying a psychological assignment far heavier than the outcome itself. Eric from distinguished between modes of living organized around having, and those organized more around being. That distinction becomes useful here. When identity is built primarily through having status, having admiration, having the relationship, having credentials, having visible proof, then losing what one is becomes an existential threat. But being operates differently. Being curious, being courageous, being disciplined, being loving, being honest, being capable of thought, being willing to learn, being present. These are not trophies stored on a shelf. They are ways of participating in life. And because they must be enacted rather than possessed, they cannot be secured once and for all. You practice them. Today, again tomorrow. Perhaps this is what someone who already has enough looks like. Not someone who has everything. Not someone without ambition. Not someone who has transcended ordinary human insecurity. But someone who has stopped sending their identity out into the world every morning, waiting to see whether circumstances will return it approved. They still care. They still work. They still desire. They still experience rejection. They still sometimes envy. They still feel disappointment when something important does not happen. But underneath the disappointment, there is ground. Something remains. I wanted this, but I did not need it to manufacture me. That sentence contains enormous freedom. And now we reach relationships, because internal insufficiency rarely remains internal. Eventually, another person can feel it. When you need someone's attention to prove that you matter, their silence becomes unbearable. When you need their affection to prove that you are lovable, Their independence becomes threatening. When you need their presence to stabilize your identity, distance begins to feel like abandonment. Then subtle behaviors appear. Over-explaining, checking, fishing for reassurance, reading meaning into response times, testing loyalty, becoming excessively agreeable, suppressing your real opinions, giving too much and secretly keeping score, trying to become indispensable, trying to make yourself impossible to leave. The tragedy is that many of these behaviors begin as attempts to preserve connection, yet they can make connection heavier. Another human being begins to feel that they are not merely being loved. They are being assigned a job. Make me feel worthy. Make me feel secure. Make me feel desirable. Make me believe I matter. Never behave in a way that awakens my doubts about myself. No person can permanently perform that job. And perhaps this explains one of the strangest experiences in human relationships. Sometimes what pushes people away is not how much we love them, but how much psychological responsibility we silently place upon their love. So the next question becomes unavoidable. What happens when another human being can feel that you need them to complete your sense of worth? Because neediness is rarely communicated only through words. It enters timing, tone, attention, boundaries, silence, overavailability, jealousy, compliance, the speed with which we abandon ourselves to keep another person. And other people often detect it long before we admit it to ourselves. That is where we go next. Chapter 7. Why people feel your neediness. People do not need supernatural abilities to know when you need something from them. They do not need to sense your energy. They do not need to read your mind. Most of the time, you tell them, not necessarily with your words. You tell them with the second message you send, because the first one went unanswered, with the explanation nobody requested, with the speed at which you agree, with the opinion you almost express, then swallow, with the joke you make to recover from a moment of silence, with how quickly you become available, with how carefully you study a change in tone, with how much meaning you assign to a delayed response, with the favor you offer before trust has had time to form, with the intimacy you attempt to create before intimacy has been earned, with the question, "Are you okay?" followed 20 minutes later by, "Did I do something?" Neediness is rarely a mysterious signal radiating invisibly from one person to another. It is usually behavior, tiny behaviors, repeated often enough to reveal the fear beneath them. And the fear is usually some version of the question we discovered in the previous chapter. If you do not choose me, what does that say about me? That is why this chapter must begin with an important distinction. Wanting closeness is not neediness. Wanting affection is not neediness. Wanting reassurance sometimes is not neediness. Wanting to be appreciated by your colleagues is not neediness. Wanting someone to answer your message is not neediness. Human beings are relational creatures. We affect one another. We need one another. Complete emotional self-sufficiency is neither realistic nor necessarily desirable. The problem begins somewhere else. It begins when another person's response is given responsibility for regulating your worth. Now, you do not merely want the message. You need the message to stop the story your mind has begun telling. You do not merely want affection. You need affection to silence the suspicion that you are undesirable. You do not merely want approval from your manager. You need approval to reassure yourself that you belong in the room. At that point, communication changes. The other person is no longer simply someone you are relating to. They have unknowingly become responsible for relieving an internal state, and that responsibility leaks into behavior. Consider a simple message. You send someone, "Would you like to have dinner Friday?" There is nothing needy about that. It is clear. It contains desire. It contains vulnerability. It creates the possibility of rejection. And then you wait. For someone with a reasonably secure relationship to the outcome, waiting may be uncomfortable. They may check their phone. They may hope. They may wonder. But fundamentally, the message has done its job. The invitation has been communicated. Now consider what happens when the invitation becomes attached to identity. An hour passes. Nothing. You open the conversation. Read your message again. Maybe it sounded too formal. You check whether they have been online. They have. Now the silence means something. You reread your previous conversations. Was their last reply shorter than usual? Perhaps they're losing interest. You consider sending another message. Maybe something humorous, something casual, something designed to make the first message look less important. You type it, delete it, type something else. Then you decide you should not send anything because that would look desperate. But now you are not actually detached. You are performing detachment, and there's an enormous difference. This distinction matters because one of the worst lessons people have absorbed about human relationships is that the solution to neediness is to look less needy. Wait 3 hours before replying. Never text twice. Make yourself unavailable. Act mysterious. Show less interest. Make them wonder where you are. Withdraw attention so they become anxious. These strategies are sometimes presented as confidence. They are not necessarily confidence. They may simply be neediness with better choreography. The person is still obsessed with the response. They have merely changed tactics. Before, they pursued attention directly. Now, they manipulate attention indirectly. The psychological dependence remains. In fact, the entire strategy still revolves around the other person. What can I do to make them respond the way I want? That is not detachment. It is control wearing sunglasses. Genuine detachment asks a different question. What would honest behavior look like if I were not trying to control the emotional result? Perhaps you send the message. Perhaps you express interest. Perhaps you tell someone you miss them. Perhaps you ask for the opportunity. Perhaps you make the offer. Perhaps you state clearly that you want the relationship. There is nothing weak about clarity. Then, you allow the other person to respond freely. That final word matters. Freely, because real relationships require freedom. And neediness often becomes problematic precisely when our fear begins interfering with another person's freedom. Psychology gives us a useful concept here. Psychological reactance. When people perceive that their freedom to choose is being threatened or restricted, they may become motivated to restore that freedom. This does not mean every unanswered message is caused by reactance. Human behavior is far too complicated for that. People become distant for thousands of reasons. But the principle helps explain why pressure can sometimes produce the opposite of what pressure was intended to accomplish. You want reassurance, so you ask for more reassurance. The other person begins feeling responsible for constantly proving the relationship. They experience pressure. They withdraw slightly. You detect the withdrawal. Your anxiety increases. You seek more reassurance. They experience more pressure. They withdraw further. You interpret the withdrawal as proof that your original fear was correct. Now, both people are participating in a loop, neither consciously designed. One person is trying to restore security. The other is trying to restore freedom. And each person's solution intensifies the other person's problem. That is a profound relationship pattern. Sometimes the behavior we use to prevent abandonment creates the interpersonal conditions that make distance more likely. This can happen in friendship. One friend becomes worried that the friendship is weakening, so they begin monitoring reciprocity. I called last time. Why haven't they called? I invited them twice. Why haven't they invited me? They sounded enthusiastic with someone else. Why weren't they that enthusiastic with me? The friendship becomes an accounting system. Every interaction generates data. Who initiated? Who replied faster? Who remembered the birthday? Who seemed warmer? Some reciprocity matters, of course. One-sided relationships exist. Neglect exists. Exploitation exists. Detachment should never be used to persuade someone to tolerate those things. But there's a difference between noticing a persistent pattern and conducting emotional surveillance. The first gathers information. The second searches for reassurance. We encountered the same distinction earlier with compulsive checking. A secure person can notice. This friendship has become consistently one-sided and make a decision. An anxious person may analyze every isolated interaction because no single interaction can provide enough certainty. Neediness also appears through over-accommodation. This version is harder to recognize because society often rewards it. The person is agreeable, flexible, helpful, easygoing. They rarely complain. They adapt. At first, This can look like generosity. Sometimes it is generosity, but sometimes there is an invisible contract beneath it. If I make myself easy enough to love, you will not leave. So they say yes when they mean no. They accept plans they dislike. They laugh at things that bother them. They suppress boundaries. They apologize when they are not responsible. They become whatever the room appears to reward. Then resentment accumulates, because somewhere inside, they expected their self-erasure to purchase security. This is one of the cruelest bargains a person can make. You abandon yourself, hoping someone else will promise not to abandon you. Eric from thinking about mature love becomes useful here. For Fromm, love was not merely a feeling one falls into. He treated mature love as involving capacities such as care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. Respect is especially important because respect requires seeing another person as a separate person, not an emotional possession, not a reassurance machine, not an audience, not a missing piece, not someone whose role is to continuously stabilize your identity. A person with preferences, boundaries, ambivalence, contradictions, private thoughts, changing emotions, and freedom. That means mature connection contains an uncomfortable truth. Someone can love you and still disappoint you. Someone can care about you and need space. Someone can respect you and disagree with you. Someone can value your work and criticize it. Someone can be interested in you and still have a life that does not revolve around you. If every expression of independence is interpreted as rejection, connection becomes exhausting. This matters professionally too. Neediness does not remain inside romance. Consider two people entering an important meeting. The first wants approval. The second needs approval. Again, the difference may be invisible at first, but listen carefully. The person who needs approval overexplains. They fill silence. They soften every disagreement. They qualify good ideas before presenting them. I'm not sure if this makes sense, but this might be stupid. Obviously, you probably know better. They laugh nervously after making a serious point. They change their opinion too quickly when challenged. They watch faces instead of following the argument. Their attention is divided. One part is participating in the meeting. Another part is continuously asking, "How am I being received?" That divided attention changes performance. The person is no longer merely communicating an idea. They are performing for permission to belong. Now compare that with secure communication. Not arrogant communication. Not cold communication. Secure communication. I disagree with that interpretation. Here's why. No hostility. No apology for existing. Or, I don't know the answer. I'll check. No elaborate defense. Or, I made an error in that analysis. This is the corrected result. No identity collapse. Or, I'd like to be considered for the position. I believe my experience in these areas would be useful. Clear interest. No attempt to disguise desire. This is important. Detachment does not require hiding what you want. Often it allows you to say what you want more clearly because you are no longer using vagueness to protect yourself from rejection. The same principle transforms romantic communication. Desperate communication often sounds like, "Are you sure you're okay? You seem different. Did I do something? I just feel like you've been distant. If you're not interested anymore, just tell me. I don't want to bother you." Notice how many jobs the other person has just been given. Explain your mood. Reassure me. Resolve my uncertainty. Confirm the relationship. Prove I have not done something wrong. Protect me from rejection. Now compare that with, "You seem quieter than usual. Is everything okay between us?" One observation. One question. Space for an answer. Or, "I enjoy spending time with you, and I'd like to keep seeing you. How are you feeling about this?" That communication contains vulnerability. It does not pretend not to care, but it also contains dignity. It allows reality to answer. This may be one of the most important signs of secure behavior. You allow reality to give you information you may not like. Neediness often attempts to negotiate with information. Someone repeatedly fails to reciprocate. You explain it away. Someone says they are not ready for commitment. You search for hidden meanings. A manager gives clear criticism. You spend the evening proving internally that they were unfair. An opportunity has closed. You continue mentally arguing with the decision. Detachment does something difficult. It lets information remain information. Not every answer is the answer you wanted, but an unwanted answer can still be useful. Sometimes rejection is not a puzzle. Sometimes distance is information. Sometimes incompatibility is simply incompatibility. Sometimes another person's no is not the beginning of a persuasion campaign. And this is where dignity enters detachment. Dignity is not pretending rejection does not hurt. It is refusing to turn pain into self-abandonment. You can say, I wanted you, without saying, therefore I must convince you to want me. You can say, this opportunity matters enormously, without saying, therefore my worth depends on receiving it. You can say, I hope this succeeds, without saying, therefore failure would make me nobody. This is the psychological posture we have been building since the beginning of this book. Desire remains, action remains, vulnerability remains, but coercion begins to disappear. There's another subtle form of neediness worth examining: premature intimacy. Sometimes people attempt to accelerate closeness because uncertainty is uncomfortable. They reveal intensely personal information immediately, create elaborate future plans after minimal contact, assign extraordinary meaning to early chemistry, treat possibility as commitment. The goal may not consciously be manipulation. Often it is certainty. Ambiguity hurts, so the mind tries to skip the ambiguous stage. But relationships have a developmental reality. Trust needs evidence. Knowledge requires time. Consistency must be observed. Someone who cannot tolerate the uncertainty of gradually knowing another person may try to manufacture the feeling of security before the relationship has actually earned it. That is not intimacy. It is certainty borrowed against the future. Something similar happens when people perform for approval. They become unusually funny around someone they want to impress, unusually agreeable, unusually impressive. They mention achievements they normally would not mention, alter their interests, adjust their personality. They are not meeting the other person. They are auditioning. And auditions create pressure because the hidden question is, which version of me would make you choose me? But even if the performance succeeds, another problem begins. Now you must maintain the character that was chosen. This is why approval obtained through self-distortion rarely feels secure. Some part of you knows. They approve performance. And so you need more approval tomorrow. This gives us a practical test. Before sending the extra message, before explaining yourself again, before saying yes when you want to say no, before asking for reassurance for the fourth time, before changing your opinion to preserve harmony, ask, am I communicating information or trying to control their response? That question catches a surprising amount. Sometimes another message is appropriate. Sometimes an explanation is necessary. Sometimes reassurance should absolutely be requested. Sometimes compromise is part of love. The behavior itself is not automatically needy. Context matters. The question is what psychological job you are asking behavior to perform. A second question helps. If I knew this person's response could not increase or decrease my fundamental worth, what would I say differently? Perhaps you would say less. Perhaps more. Perhaps you would finally tell the truth. Perhaps you would stop pretending not to care. Perhaps you would stop chasing. Perhaps you would leave. Perhaps you would apologize. Perhaps you would establish a boundary. Perhaps you would make the invitation you have been afraid to make. Detachment does not always make people quieter. Sometimes it makes them more direct. And this is why the lesson of this chapter is not, pretend you don't care so people chase you. That is manipulation. And manipulation is still attachment because your behavior remains organized around producing a particular response. You disappear so they miss you. You delay so they wonder. You withhold affection so they become insecure. You manufacture scarcity so they value you. The strategy may look detached, but internally, you are watching the outcome more closely than ever. That is, chasing from a distance. The lesson is something harder. Care deeply without turning another person's response into a referendum on your worth. Tell the truth. Express interest. Maintain boundaries. Respect space. Ask clear questions. Listen to answers. Allow disagreement. Notice patterns. Accept information. And let another human being remain free. Because freedom is not the enemy of connection. It is one of the conditions that makes genuine connection possible. If someone stays only because you have made leaving psychologically expensive, you do not have security. You have compliance. If someone agrees because disagreement always creates emotional punishment, you do not have harmony. You have fear. If someone constantly reassures you because otherwise a relationship becomes unstable, you do not have certainty. You have maintenance. Secure connection has room inside it. Room for two minds, two lives, two sets of preferences, two people who can approach each other without either one disappearing. And perhaps this reveals something deeper about detachment itself. Throughout this book, we have been discussing letting go. But letting go can sound passive, like opening your hand and doing nothing. Yet the kind of detachment we are describing requires action. You may need to speak. You may need to stop speaking. You may need to apply. You may need to walk away. You may need to persist. You may need to change direction. You may need to express love without knowing whether it will be returned. You may need to work intensely without knowing whether the work will succeed. You may need to make the best decision available and then live without certainty about what follows. So we arrive at the question that separates genuine detachment from all its counterfeits. If detachment is not pretending not to care, if it is not manipulating people into pursuing you, if it is not laziness, if it is not resignation, if it is not suppressing desire, and if it is not passively waiting for life to deliver what you want, then what does letting go actually look like in action? That is where we go next. Chapter 8. Letting go without becoming passive. There's a mistake people make when they first hear the language of detachment. They think letting go means doing less. Sometimes it does, but not always. Sometimes letting go means sending the application, making the call, having the conversation, publishing the work, walking into the room, asking the question, starting again. What changes is not whether you participate. What changes is whether you try to force reality to obey you after your part has been played. That gives us a principle worth carrying forward. Let go of controlling reality, not of participating in it. This is a line between surrender and passivity. Passivity withdraws from life. Detachment remains fully involved, but stops confusing involvement with command. Consider a job application. Passivity says, if it is meant for me, it will find me. That can sound peaceful. It can also be avoidance. Mature detachment says, I will prepare the strongest application I can. I will tailor it. I will improve my skills. I will submit it on time. I will follow up appropriately. I will prepare for the interview. And then I will not spend the next 14 days mentally trying to force the hiring committee to choose me. That is participation without domination. Relationships require the same distinction. Passivity says, I won't say what I need. If they really cared, they would just know. Detachment says, I will communicate clearly. Passivity says, I won't confront the problem because I am surrendering. Detachment says, I will address what needs to be addressed and allow the other person to respond as they will. Passivity can look calm while hiding fear. Fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of being seen as difficult, fear of discovering the truth. Detachment is not always quiet. Sometimes it speaks. Sometimes it says no. Sometimes it leaves. Sometimes it stays and works. Sometimes it apologizes. Sometimes it asks directly, do you want this relationship too? The important thing is that it does not use action to manufacture an answer. This is where people become confused. If you cannot control outcomes, why act at all? Because action still changes probabilities. Action builds skill. Action expresses values. Action creates opportunities. Action gathers information. Action reveals reality. You may not control whether someone hires you, but applying matters. You may not control whether a business succeeds, but learning from customers matters. You may not control whether a relationship survives, but honesty matters. You may not control whether a paper is accepted, but the quality of the research and writing matters. You may not control every health outcome, but sleep, nutrition, exercise, and medical care still matter. Detachment is not a denial of causality. It is a refusal to exaggerate your causality. You are a participant in reality, not its sole author. Lao Tzu's philosophy is often dragged into modern self-help and reduced to the phrase, just go with the flow. That is too shallow. The concept of Wu Wei is often translated as non-action, but that translation can be misleading if it suggests laziness. A better way to understand it is action, without unnecessary forcing. Action that fits the situation. Action that does not create more friction than the task itself requires. A skilled swimmer does not defeat the water by fighting every movement. A good rider does not control a horse by constant panic and tension. A good conversation is not improved by trying to script every response before it happens. The point is not to stop acting. The point is to stop adding unnecessary struggle to the action. This is a subtle but powerful distinction. There is the difficulty of the task, and then there is a difficulty we add by resisting uncertainty, demanding speed, fearing every setback, and trying to guarantee the result. One difficulty belongs to reality. The other is often generated by our relationship with reality. Call this unnecessary internal friction. You have a presentation to prepare. That is work. Then you add, what if I embarrass myself? What if everyone sees that I am not good enough? What if this ruins my reputation? What if I freeze? Now, the task is no longer simply preparing the presentation. You are preparing the presentation while also defending your identity against a future event that has not happened. That extra layer consumes energy. Or consider academic work. A student has a thesis to revise. That is already demanding. Then the mind adds, I should be further ahead. What if my supervisor thinks I am incompetent? What if the corrections are endless? What if I fail? What if I disappoint everyone? Again, one task has become two, the actual work, and the psychological battle around the work. Detachment reduces the second task, not the first. This is why some people become more effective when they stop chasing, not because the universe rewards surrender, because mental energy stops leaking into unnecessary control. Attention becomes available. Judgment becomes cleaner. Patience improves. You stop making frantic adjustments. You begin seeing what is actually happening instead of what fear says is happening. There's a practical way to apply this, called the 3-move rule. Whenever you are facing a difficult goal, ask 3 questions. 1. What intelligent action is available now? Not eventually, not theoretically. Now, if you want a job, revise the application. Contact the person. Practice the interview. If you want to repair a relationship, have the conversation. State the boundary. Ask the question. If you're building a business, talk to customers. Improve the offer. Study the numbers. If you are creating, write the page. Edit the video. Publish the work. If you are studying, read. Practice. Analyze. Seek feedback. If you are improving your health, follow the plan. Sleep. Move. Eat appropriately. Seek professional guidance when needed. If you are trying to improve your finances, review spending. Increase savings. Improve earning capacity. Make a realistic plan. The first move is action, and it should be concrete. 2. What must be allowed time to develop? This is where many people sabotage themselves. Some processes have latency. They require time between effort and visible result. A job application requires processing. Trust in a relationship requires repeated experience. A business strategy needs enough data. A creative project may need time to find its audience. Academic work may require multiple drafts. Fitness changes slowly. Financial compounding is almost insulting in its early stages because so little appears to happen. Patience is not doing nothing. Patience is refusing to interrupt the process simply because the result has not appeared on your preferred schedule. This is where the modern mind often struggles. We are accustomed to immediate feedback, refresh, update, notification, response. But meaningful processes frequently operate on slower clocks. The detached person asks, what would I allow this to become if I stopped demanding proof every day? 3. What part of this outcome cannot be commanded? This is the hardest question, because this is where the ego reaches the edge of its authority. You cannot command another person's love. You cannot command an employer's decision. You cannot command a market. You cannot command readers to care. You cannot command a body to change instantly. You cannot command a reviewer to accept your paper. You cannot command time. You cannot command luck. You cannot command every consequence. You can influence some of these, but influence is not ownership. The third move is where surrender becomes intelligent, not because nothing matters, but because some things matter without belonging to your control. Let's apply the 3-move rule to several areas. A job search. Action. Improve the application. Network. Prepare. Apply consistently. Time. Allow organizations to respond. Allow the process to unfold. Uncertainty. Who else applied? Internal politics. Budget changes. Final decisions. Now a relationship. Action. Communicate honestly. Listen. Show care. Set boundaries. Time. Allow trust to build. Allow conflict to settle. Allow patterns to become visible. Uncertainty. Another person's private emotions. Their readiness. Their choices. Their future. Business. Action. Test the product. Speak to customers. Improve operations. Track cash flow. Time. Allow a strategy to generate evidence. Allow trust and reputation to accumulate. Uncertainty. Competitors. Market shifts. Customer behavior. Economic conditions. Creative work. Action. Make the strongest work you can. Publish consistently. Improve your craft. Time. Allow the work to travel. Allow the audience to form. Uncertainty. Who discovers it? When it gets shared. Whether something unexpectedly resonates. Academic work. Action. Research carefully. Analyze honestly. Write clearly. Revise. Time. Allow feedback. Allow arguments to mature. Uncertainty. Reviewer reactions. Publication decisions. Unexpected findings. Health. Action. Follow evidence-based habits. Train appropriately. Seek medical advice where needed. Time. Allow physiology to adapt. Allow recovery. Uncertainty. Genetics. Unexpected illness. Exaggerated change. Money. Action. Spend deliberately. Save. Invest prudently. Develop useful skills. Time. Allow compounding. Allow career growth. Uncertainty. Markets. Inflation. Unexpected expenses. Economic shocks. Across all of these, the structure is the same. Act. Allow. Release. People often confuse acceptance with resignation because both stop fighting reality. But resignation says, this is how it is, so nothing can change. Acceptance says, this is how it is, so now I can respond accurately. That is a major difference. You cannot intelligently change what you refuse to see. If a relationship is failing, denial is not hope. If a business model is not working, pretending is not faith. If a strategy has produced enough poor evidence, patience becomes stubbornness. Detachment includes the courage to update your beliefs. You are not attached to the outcome. You are also not attached to being right. That is a deeper form of non-attachment. This matters because sometimes never give up is terrible advice. Persistence is useful when the path is difficult but still viable. Persistence becomes destructive when reality has repeatedly provided clear evidence that the method must change. Mature detachment asks, am I persisting because the goal still matters, or because changing course would injure my identity? There is a difference between commitment and ego. Sometimes a person keeps forcing a dead strategy because stopping would feel like admitting failure. But what if the wiser move is not more force, but less attachment to the current form? You can stay committed to the deeper goal while changing the method. You can want meaningful work and leave the wrong job. You can want love and end the wrong relationship. You can want financial success and abandon the wrong business model. You can want a scientific answer and abandon a hypothesis that the data no longer supports. Detachment allows flexibility because identity is no longer fused with one route. There is also a quiet courage in not acting. This is difficult for ambitious people. If you are used to solving problems, stillness can feel irresponsible. But not every urge deserves action. Sometimes you've already sent the message, already followed up, already apologized, already made the offer, already published the work, already done the analysis, already waited an appropriate interval. Now fear invents another move. Send something else. Change it again. Explain more. Check again. Lower the price. Raise the price. Rewrite everything. Call again. Post again. Do something. Anything. The urge feels urgent because uncertainty feels intolerable. But urgency is not always information. Sometimes urgency is simply discomfort asking to become behavior. This is where restraint becomes a form of agency. You are not doing nothing. You are refusing to let anxiety make decisions. That may be one of the deepest meanings of effortless action. Not effort-free action. Not lazy action. Action without unnecessary psychological friction. You still prepare, still work, still care, still risk, but you do not drag fear behind every movement. You do not perform the task, and simultaneously demand that the task reassure you. You do not take the action, and then mentally redo it for 6 hours. You do not ask reality for an answer every 20 minutes. You do not confuse impatience with insight. You move where movement is useful. You wait where waiting is useful. You change where evidence requires change. And you release what no action can command. This is what letting go looks like when it is alive. It is not sitting still. It is cleaner participation. It is the ability to say, this is mine to do, so I will do it. This needs time, so I will allow it. This is not mine to command, so I will stop trying to command it. 3 moves. Simple in language, difficult in practice. But life becomes clearer when responsibility and control are no longer confused. And eventually, a strange possibility appears. You begin to notice that some of your greatest breakthroughs did not happen because you discovered a brilliant new action. They happened because you stopped doing something that was getting in the way. You stopped checking, stopped over-explaining, stopped micromanaging, stopped changing the plan every day, stopped asking for reassurance, stopped trying to be liked by everyone, stopped forcing the timing, stopped making every result mean something about your worth. Nothing magical happened. You simply removed friction. And once the unnecessary interference disappeared, the useful actions had room to work. This leads us to an even stranger question. What if some problems do not need another strategy, another message, another adjustment, another push? What if sometimes a breakthrough does not come from discovering another action, but from finally stopping the unnecessary ones? Chapter 9. The Strange Power of No Longer Forcing. Some things respond beautifully to effort. Lift a weight consistently, and the body adapts. Study deliberately, and knowledge accumulates. Practice a skill, and competence grows. Save money, and the balance changes. But there's another category of human experience that behaves strangely under direct command. Sleep, confidence, creativity, attraction, relaxation, happiness, being liked. Try giving yourself an order tonight. Sleep now, not soon, not eventually. Now, you cannot obey it. You can turn off the lights. You can close your eyes. You can put the phone away. You can make the room comfortable. You can create conditions favorable to sleep. But sleep itself must happen. And once you begin desperately trying to make it happen, something peculiar occurs. You check the clock. You calculate how many hours remain. You become aware that you are still awake. You try harder. You become frustrated that trying harder isn't working. Your body becomes more alert precisely because you are monitoring whether it is relaxed. And now you are attempting to force unconsciousness through conscious effort. The command defeats itself. Confidence behaves similarly. Tell someone, be confident. They may straighten their shoulders, control their voice, rehearse what to say. But if their attention remains fixed on the question, do I look confident? They become more self-conscious. They monitor their hands, their posture, their facial expression, their voice. The attempt to manufacture confidence creates more evidence inside their own mind that confidence is absent. Creativity can behave this way too. A writer sits down and demands, "I must produce something brilliant today." Suddenly, every sentence is judged before it's finished. Every idea is compared with an invisible masterpiece. The mind becomes both creator and executioner. Nothing survives long enough to develop. Attraction resists command. You cannot negotiate someone into genuinely desiring you. You can become more attractive in many ordinary ways. You can take care of yourself, communicate better, become interesting, be attentive, develop confidence, create opportunities for connection. But another person's attraction remains partly outside your authority. The moment you begin trying to manufacture their response, your behavior often changes. You perform, you calculate, you overaccommodate. You become frightened of disagreement. You start asking, without necessarily saying the words, "Is this working?" And as we discovered earlier, people often feel the pressure contained inside that question. Relaxation contains the same contradiction. Relax. Few commands are less relaxing. And happiness may be the strangest of all. A person can construct a meaningful life and still discover that demanding happiness from every moment makes ordinary sadness feel like failure. There are experiences we can influence without being able to command. That distinction brings us to one of the strangest problems in human behavior. Sometimes, the attempt to force a state becomes part of what prevents a state, the paradox of control. There is a simple assumption hidden beneath much of our behavior. If effort helps, more effort should help more. But Chapter 1 already exposed a flaw in that logic. Effort is not one substance. There is physical effort, cognitive effort, strategic effort, emotional effort, and then there is something else, control effort. Control effort is what happens when we try to eliminate uncertainty by applying psychological pressure to something that cannot fully obey us. It is the person who has already sent a good application, then rewrites their resume 12 more times because waiting feels unbearable. It is a creator who has already published, then checks analytics every 15 minutes. It is the person who has already communicated their feelings, then sends another message to control how the first message was interpreted. It is the student who is prepared carefully, then studies frantically during the final hour, not because another hour will substantially improve performance, but because stopping would require facing uncertainty. From the outside, all of this looks like effort. From the inside, some of it is fear, wearing work clothes. That distinction matters, because productive effort changes the process. Compulsive effort often changes only how temporarily safe we feel. Alan Watts frequently explored a paradox, sometimes described as a law of reversed effort, the idea that certain psychological states become harder to attain when pursued through excessive conscious strain. This should not be mistaken for a scientific law of the universe. It does not mean that wanting money makes money disappear. It does not mean that pursuing a career repels success. It does not mean that the cosmos detects desperation and withholds your desires. The useful insight is more grounded. There are goals in which excessive self-monitoring and deliberate control interfere with processes that function better when some automaticity, spontaneity, or uncertainty is allowed. Sleep is an obvious example, but performance gives us another. A musician practices a difficult passage thousands of times. During practice, conscious correction is valuable. Finger placement, timing, technique, repetition. But during the performance, trying consciously to supervise every movement can disrupt the fluency that practice was designed to create. The preparation required control. The performance requires a degree of release. That is the paradox. You train deliberately so that eventually you do not have to consciously control everything you trained. This occurs in public speaking. Someone prepares thoroughly. They know the material. They have rehearsed. But when they walk onto the stage, they begin observing themselves from the audience's perspective. How do I sound? Where are my hands? Did that sentence sound intelligent? Why isn't that person smiling? Did I pause too long? Now, part of the brain is delivering the presentation, while another part is conducting a live performance review. The speaker has divided their attention between doing and watching themselves doing. The desire to control the impression begins damaging the performance. The solution is not less preparation. It is knowing when preparation has ended. That sentence applies far beyond public speaking. Many people know how to begin effort, but they never learn how to end it when force works. We should be careful here. Not all force is bad. Sometimes you should push. The alarm rings and you do not want to get up. Get up. The assignment needs finishing. Finish it. The training session is difficult. Continue. A boundary needs to be stated. State it. A business is failing because nobody is selling. Sell. A skill is weak because you have avoided practice. Practice. There are moments when discomfort should not be interpreted as a sign to surrender. Detachment can become an elegant excuse for avoidance if we are not careful. Someone says, I am no longer forcing my career, but they have stopped applying. I am detaching from money, but they refuse to examine their finances. I am letting the relationship unfold naturally, but they avoid necessary conversations. I am trusting the creative process, but they never sit down to create. That is not detachment. That is disengagement dressed in philosophical language. The question is not whether effort feels uncomfortable. The question is whether effort is functionally useful. This gives us a diagnostic. Call it the force test. When you feel the urge to do more, ask, is additional effort improving the process, or merely soothing my fear that I haven't done enough? Sit with that question, because the difference can be difficult to detect. Both behaviors feel productive. Both can involve action. Both can even produce exhaustion. But their psychological functions are different. One serves the goal. The other serves anxiety. You submit an academic paper. You notice a genuine methodological problem. Correcting it improves the work. That passes the force test. But if the work is already submitted, and you spend 3 hours rereading your sent version because you are terrified that you missed something, you are no longer improving the paper. You are trying to obtain certainty from an action incapable of providing it. You send someone an important message. Later you realize you communicated something inaccurately. A clarification may be useful, but suppose the message was clear. They simply have not replied. Now you want to send another, then another, not because new information exists, but because silence is becoming emotionally intolerable. The additional message is no longer primarily communication. It is an attempt to regulate your anxiety through another person's response. That fails the force test. You publish a video, article, song, or piece of creative work. You review meaningful performance data at a sensible interval. Useful. You learn. You adjust. But checking the numbers every few minutes does not improve the published work. The behavior gives you something else. Tiny doses of certainty. Perhaps the number rose. Relief. Perhaps it did not. Anxiety. Check again. Now measurement has stopped serving strategy. Strategy is serving measurement. The force test can even be applied to self-improvement. There is a strange point at which trying to fix yourself becomes another way of continuously telling yourself that something is wrong with you. Another book, another routine, another morning ritual, another productivity system, another reinvention, another promise that this time you will finally become acceptable to yourself. Growth can be healthy. But endless self-correction can conceal an extraordinary belief. I am in a permanent emergency. And perhaps some people do not need another method of improving themselves. Perhaps they need a period in which they stop relating to themselves as a problem under constant repair. That does not mean abandoning growth. It means asking what the growth is for. The same distinction appears in money. Financial discipline is useful. Budgeting is useful. Learning is useful. Building valuable skills is useful. Seeking better opportunities is useful. But there is a point at which obsessively checking an investment, account balance, or income metric does not improve financial reality. It merely makes the nervous system experience every fluctuation as a verdict. A number becomes emotional weather. Up, you feel secure. Down, you feel endangered. The problem is no longer simply financial. Your sense of safety has become synchronized with a screen. This may be why forcing is so seductive. It creates a sensation of involvement. Doing something feels safer than waiting. Even useless action can feel psychologically preferable to uncertainty. That is the hidden bargain. We tell ourselves, as long as I am doing something, I am still in control. But activity and control are not the same. Sometimes activity is precisely how we avoid admitting that control has ended. You made the decision. You prepared. You applied. You spoke. You apologized. You submitted. You invested. You published. You asked. Now, there may be nothing intelligent left to do, and that moment can be terrifying because you are standing at the border between agency and uncertainty. Behind you is everything you could influence. Ahead of you, life gets a vote, the intelligence of stopping. We praise people for persistence. Less often do we praise them for stopping at the correct moment. Yet stopping requires intelligence. A surgeon must know when enough tissue has been removed. A scientist must know when additional measurement adds little information. A writer must eventually stop editing. An entrepreneur must eventually release the product. A speaker must eventually stop rehearsing and walk onto the stage. A person in love must eventually stop performing and allow themselves to be known. Every craft contains a point where more intervention can begin degrading what previous intervention created. There's an art to enough, not because perfection is undesirable, but because perfection often has no natural stopping rule. There's always another adjustment available, another sentence to rewrite, another possibility to consider, another opinion to obtain, another metric to inspect, another contingency to prepare for. If you require certainty before releasing your grip, you will never release it. Certainty is rarely what tells us when to stop. Judgment does. This is where detachment begins becoming something more sophisticated than letting go. Detachment is knowing where effort belongs. It is putting effort into preparation rather than prediction, into communication rather than mind reading, into financial behavior rather than controlling markets, into creative practice rather than demanding applause, into love rather than possession, into health rather than terror of mortality, into character rather than reputation. You are not reducing effort indiscriminately. You are relocating it from what cannot obey you toward what can. That is not passivity. That is precision. There is a final form of forcing that is especially difficult to recognize, trying to force yourself to detach. You tell yourself, I shouldn't care. I need to stop wanting this. I must let go. Why haven't I detached yet? And suddenly, detachment itself becomes another achievement you are chasing, another test you can fail, another state you are trying to command. The contradiction is almost perfect. You are desperately trying not to be desperate. You are anxiously trying not to be anxious. You are forcing yourself to stop forcing. That is not freedom. Detachment does not require you to stop caring. You may still want the outcome. You may still feel disappointed. You may still check occasionally. You may still experience fear. The change is quieter. You stop treating every uncomfortable feeling as an instruction. Fear says, do something. You ask whether something useful actually needs doing. Uncertainty says, check again. You ask whether new information is reasonably available. Desire says, I want this. You allow the sentence to end there. You do not automatically add. And therefore I cannot be okay without it. Perhaps this is the strange power of no longer forcing. Not that life suddenly gives you everything. Sometimes it will not. Some applications will still be rejected. Some relationships will end. Some businesses will fail. Some creative work will disappear unnoticed. Some ambitions will require years. Some outcomes will remain outside your control, regardless of how peaceful you become. Detachment is not a bargain with reality. It is not, I will stop forcing if you promise to give me what I want. That would simply be chasing in disguise. Real detachment makes no such deal. It says, I will act intelligently because action is mine. I will learn because learning is mine. I will prepare because preparation is mine. I will persist where persistence remains useful. I will change direction when evidence requires it. And when I reach the boundary beyond which additional effort becomes psychological interference, I will stop, not because I no longer care, because caring does not require controlling. There comes a point when the application must be sent. The conversation must be allowed to breathe. The seed must remain underground. The work must meet the world. The body must sleep. The answer must come from someone else. The result must develop without your supervision. And at that boundary, maturity asks for something difficult. Not another technique. Not another check. Not another push. Restraint. You have done what can reasonably be done. Now, there is one final discipline, perhaps the hardest one. Act deliberately, then release. Chapter 10. Act, then release. There is a pattern that looks responsible, but quietly destroys peace. It begins well. You make a decision. You take action. Then instead of allowing the action to stand, you continue acting in your head. You replay, recheck, reconsider, reopen, recalculate. You ask whether the decision was right before the consequences have even had time to appear. You interfere. You doubt. You restart. And eventually, you become exhausted not because the goal required too much effort, but because you never allowed any effort to become complete. This chapter is about ending that cycle, not by caring less, not by becoming passive, but by giving action a beginning and an end. The system is simple. Decide, act, release, review for stages. Most people understand the first two. The last two are where chasing usually begins. Consider Maya. She has spent months developing a new consulting offer. She has researched the market, spoken with potential clients, refined the service, built a landing page, prepared her pricing. She knows the work is not perfect, but it is ready enough to test. So she decides to launch. This is a first stage. Decide. To decide is not merely to choose an action. It is to define what matters and what standard you are willing to use. Maya's decision is not, I want this to become a huge success. That is an outcome. Her decision is, I am going to launch this offer. Contact 20 qualified prospects and give the test 30 days before evaluating the core strategy. That is a decision. It contains a direction, a behavior, a time frame, a standard for review. This matters because vague goals produce constant renegotiation. If your only decision is, I want this to work, then every hour becomes a possible review point. Every fluctuation becomes meaningful. Every silence becomes a reason to reconsider. But when you define the decision properly, you reduce unnecessary ambiguity. This is one of the first protections against chasing. The goal is not merely to know what you want. It is to know what you have decided to do before fear begins rewriting the agreement. The second stage is ACT. Maya sends the first outreach messages. She contacts prospects. She posts about the offer. She follows up where appropriate. She improves a confusing section of the landing page. She answers questions. She records objections. This is action, real action. Action changes something. It creates exposure, generates information, builds skill, improves probability. The standard here should be high, not frantic. High, you do the best work reasonably available. You do not use detachment as an excuse for mediocrity. You do not say, I am releasing the outcome, when what you really mean is, I did not prepare. The principle from earlier chapters still holds. Maximum responsibility for the action, minimum dependence on the result. Maya can improve her offer. She can communicate clearly. She can choose relevant prospects. She can follow up. She can learn. All of that belongs substantially to her. So she acts. Then something difficult happens. She finishes today's work. And now she reaches the stage most people skip. Release. Release means stop mentally performing an action that has already been completed. This is a very specific skill. You sent the email. The email is no longer being sent. You submitted the application. The application is no longer being submitted. You published the work. Publishing is complete. You had the conversation. The conversation has happened. But psychologically, many people continue trying to perform completed actions. Maya sends 10 outreach emails at 10 a.m. By 10:12, she checks whether anyone opened them. At 10:20, she checks again. At 10:34, she wonders whether the subject line was wrong. At 10:41, she begins rewriting the outreach message. At 11:05, one person replies, "Thanks, not right now." Maya's nervous system translates this into, the offer is wrong. At noon, she is researching new pricing models. By 2, she is considering changing the entire service. By 4, she is wondering whether consulting was a mistake. 1 day ago, she had a 30-day experiment. Now she is trying to redesign her business before the experiment has even begun. This is what happens when release is missing. The cycle becomes decide, act, worry, check, interfere, doubt, restart. And every restart destroys accumulated evidence. This pattern appears everywhere. Someone begins an exercise plan. Day 1, good. Day 2, good. Day 3, the scale rises slightly. Worry, check, interfere. Maybe carbohydrates are the problem. New plan. For days later, another change. Now, they are not conducting one experiment. They are conducting 7 incomplete experiments. A student chooses a study method. 2 days later, the material still feels difficult. Maybe the method is wrong. New method. A creator commits to a content strategy. One upload performs poorly. Change the topic. Change the title structure. Change the audience. Change everything. A person in a relationship communicates a concern. Then, because the other person does not immediately respond in the desired way, they explain again, then soften it, then apologize for bringing it up, then reopen the subject. The original communication never gets a chance to stand. This is what release prevents. Release is not neglect. It is non-interference during the period in which no new intelligent action is required. That leads to the 4th stage. Review. Review is where detachment becomes disciplined rather than vague. Release does not mean never look at the results. That would be irrational. Results matter. Feedback matters. Data matters. Reality matters. The key is that review happens at a predetermined time, not whenever anxiety demands it. Maya decided before launching that she would give the offer 30 days. That does not mean she ignores obvious emergencies. If the payment system breaks, fix it. If every prospect says the offer is confusing in exactly the same way, that is useful information. If there's a factual error on the page, correct it. But she does not treat every isolated response as a verdict. At the end of the review window, she asks, how many people saw the offer? How many responded? What objections repeated? What converted? What confused people? What was the response rate? Which assumptions were supported? Which were not? That is review. Notice how different this feels from compulsive checking. Compulsive checking asks, is it working yet? Review asks, what does the accumulated evidence show? One seeks relief. The other seeks information. This distinction can change how you work tomorrow. Pick one meaningful goal, then define a review window before you take the next action. Suppose you're applying for jobs. Your window might be 1 week for evaluating response rate across a batch of applications. Suppose you're building a creative project. Perhaps you review performance after a defined number of uploads, not every 15 minutes after posting. Suppose you're working on fitness. You might review trends weekly or monthly, depending on the metric, rather than letting every daily fluctuation determine your mood. Suppose you are saving money. You might review the plan once a month. Suppose you're trying to improve a relationship. You might decide, I will communicate clearly, observe behavior over the next few weeks, and avoid interpreting every single interaction. The exact interval depends on the process, but the principle is stable. Do not allow emotion to choose the review frequency. Choose it while calm. Then obey the agreement when anxious. That is self-trust. There's a deeper reason review windows work. Without them, every moment becomes a decision point. Should I continue? Should I stop? Should I change? Should I check? Should I follow up? Should I wait? Should I start over? That is cognitively exhausting. Continuous reevaluation destroys commitment. You never inhabit the decision long enough to discover what the decision can produce. A review window says, until this point, I am not reopening the whole question without genuinely new information. That frees attention. You can work, rest, think about other things. Live. Your goal stops demanding a vote every hour. Maya writes 4 sentences on a piece of paper. Decide. Test this offer for 30 days. ACT. Contact the right people, communicate clearly, follow up appropriately, record feedback. Release. No rebuilding the entire offer because of isolated reactions. Review. Day 30. Evaluate accumulated evidence. Simple, but the power is in what happens on day 4. 3 prospects have said no. 1 has not replied. 1 person asked for a lower price. Maya feels the old urge. Maybe this is failing. She wants to change everything. Then she asks, has new evidence appeared that requires action? Or has discomfort appeared that wants action? That question interrupts the cycle, because discomfort and evidence are not the same. She may still change something, but only if the change is justified. That is how detachment becomes intelligent rather than passive. The same system can be used for decisions that are not measurable in obvious numbers. Consider a relationship. Decide, I will stop avoiding this issue and communicate clearly. ACT. Have a conversation honestly and respectfully. Release. Stop sending secondary explanations because the first conversation felt uncomfortable. Review. Observe whether behavior changes over a reasonable period. This prevents a common mistake. People often keep talking when what they actually need is information from behavior. They explain the same boundary 5 different ways. They repeat what hurt them, rephrase it, soften it, strengthen it. At some point, the issue is no longer whether the other person understands. The issue is what they do with the information. Release allows you to see that. A creator can use the same method. Decide. Publish consistently around 1 clear theme for 8 weeks. ACT. Make strong work. Release. Stop reinventing the channel after every upload. Review. Evaluate patterns across the full 8-week sample. An academic can use it. Decide. Finish this draft before chasing perfection. ACT. Write and revise according to clear standards. Release. Stop reopening completed sections without a reason. Review. Return during the scheduled revision pass. A person improving finances can use it. Decide. Follow this budget and savings plan for 3 months. ACT. Automate saving. Track spending. Follow the rules. Release. Stop redesigning the plan every time an unexpected expense causes anxiety. Review. Evaluate after enough time has passed to see a real pattern. The system scales because it mirrors something basic about reality. Good action requires focus. Good judgment requires distance. Try and do both continuously often produces neither. There is another subtle benefit. Review windows prevent identity from being continuously negotiated. If you judge yourself every day, you never get to simply practice. 1 bad day becomes, I am failing. 1 good day becomes, I am finally succeeding. Then the next bad day destroys the identity again. This creates an exhausting emotional market in which your self-worth rises and falls with short-term performance. A review window says, this moment is data, not identity. That is a profound psychological shift. You can have a bad day without deciding what the bad day means about your future. You can receive a rejection without turning it into a philosophy of your life. You can experience slow progress without immediately declaring the strategy dead. But release has another dimension. It means releasing the fantasy that you can think your way into certainty after the action is complete. This is where rumination enters. You finish an important interview. Later that night, why did I answer like that? Was that joke unnecessary? Did they like me? What did that expression mean? You replay the interaction. But the interview is not happening anymore. You are not preparing for it. You are conducting a simulation of a closed event. The mind hopes that enough analysis will produce certainty. It cannot. The event already exists. The only useful review comes when new information or a genuine learning point is available. Everything beyond that may simply be repetition. Release says, the action is over. Stop trying to alter the past through thought. That sentence can save hours of life. There is one final question that keeps the system honest. What would justify reopening the decision before the review window? Define this in advance too. A genuine emergency, material new information, clear evidence of harm, a major change in circumstances, repeated feedback strong enough to invalidate the original assumption. This prevents the opposite error. Detachment should not make you rigid. You are not obeying the original plan simply because you wrote it down. You are protecting the plan from emotional interference while leaving it open to meaningful evidence. That is the balance. Over time, decide ACT release review creates something rare. A person who can trust their own decisions without becoming trapped by them. You decide carefully, act fully, release honestly, review intelligently, then decide again. There's rhythm in that. Action, space, observation, adaptation, not constant tension, not endless mental supervision. And perhaps this is what makes detachment so practical. It gives your goals boundaries. You stop carrying them every second. There's a time for work, a time for waiting, a time for evidence, a time for revision. The goal remains important, but it no longer occupies every room in your mind. Maya eventually becomes better at this. She launches, works, leaves the dashboard alone more often, records feedback, keeps living. Day 30 arrives. Now she reviews. Perhaps the offer worked. Perhaps it did not. Either way, she has something valuable. Real information, not anxiety, not guesses, not 10 incomplete strategies. Evidence. And then she can make the next decision from reality rather than fear. But there is a harder situation. Harder than launching. Harder than waiting 1 week. Harder than resisting the urge to check. What happens when you do everything correctly and reality gives you almost nothing back? You decide carefully. You act well. You release. You respect the review window. You wait. The inbox remains empty. The audience barely moves. The business does not grow. The relationship does not change. The application goes unanswered. The work disappears into silence. You acted. You released. You waited. And nothing happened. That is the moment when detachment stops being a technique and becomes a philosophy. Chapter 11. When nothing seems to be happening, there is a particular kind of silence that comes after effort. You applied, and nobody replied. You built the business, and the customers did not come. You published the work, and almost nobody noticed. You had the conversation, and the relationship remains uncertain. You conducted the experiment, and the hypothesis failed. You followed the plan, and your body seems to be changing painfully slowly. You prepared. You acted. You released. You waited. And now, nothing seems to be happening. This is where almost every philosophy of detachment becomes easy to misunderstand, because it is easy to talk about releasing outcomes when the outcomes are arriving. It is easy to praise patience when progress is visible. It is easy to say, trust the process, when the process keeps sending reassuring little signals that it can be trusted. But what happens when there are no signals? What happens when effort produces silence? That is a different test. And perhaps the hardest question in this entire book begins here. Who are you during the period when your effort has not yet been rewarded? There are at least two very different stories we can tell ourselves when nothing seems to be happening. The first is, it hasn't happened yet. The second is, this strategy isn't working. They sound similar. They are not. One suggests patience. The other suggests adaptation. And wisdom consists partly in knowing which sentence reality is actually telling you. That is difficult because desire interferes with interpretation. When we desperately want something to work, we can turn patience into denial. When we are terrified of failure, we can turn temporary silence into proof that everything is hopeless. The desperate mind has trouble reading evidence because it does not merely want information. It wants a verdict that feels safe. Consider someone searching for work. She sends 5 carefully prepared applications. 3 days pass. No replies. What does this mean? Very little. The sample is small. The time horizon is short. The hiring process may be slow. Silence at this stage contains limited information. It hasn't happened yet, may be perfectly rational. Now change the scenario. She sends 300 applications over 8 months. Almost no interviews. She has repeatedly used the same resume, the same positioning, and the same application strategy. At this point, repeating, it hasn't happened yet, may no longer be patience. The evidence is beginning to speak. Perhaps the resume is weak. Perhaps the roles are mismatched. Perhaps her skills are not being communicated clearly. Perhaps the market is unusually difficult. Perhaps she needs referrals, different positioning, additional experience, or a different target. Detachment does not ask her to keep sending identical applications forever. It allows her to look at the evidence without interpreting the evidence as a judgment of her worth. That distinction is everything. A strategy can fail without you becoming a failure. And once identity is removed from the verdict, changing direction becomes much easier. This is one reason chasing makes people strangely rigid. We often assume desperate people change direction constantly. Sometimes they do, but desperation can produce the opposite. A person may become unable to abandon a failing strategy because they have invested too much identity in proving that it must work. The business must succeed. The relationship must survive. The research must confirm the hypothesis. The career must unfold according to the original plan. Otherwise, what was all that effort for? Now, persistence is no longer serving the goal. It is defending the ego from the meaning attached to changing course. There is a well-known cognitive tendency here. Once we have invested time, money, or emotion into something, previous investment can influence whether we continue, even when the better question concerns future costs and future benefits. But there is another bias worth remembering: survivorship bias. We hear it disproportionately from the people whose persistence eventually paid off. The entrepreneur who heard no 100 times, then built the company. The author who collected rejection letters, then became famous. The researcher whose repeated failures preceded the breakthrough. The performer who spent years unnoticed, then became successful. Their stories are compelling. But there were also people who persisted for years and did not receive the desired result. They rarely give the keynote speech. This does not make persistence foolish. It makes persistence a strategy, not a guarantee. And mature hope must be strong enough to survive that truth. So, how do you know whether to continue? Start with 4 things: time horizon, feedback, controllable inputs, evidence. First, time horizon. Some processes are naturally slow. You cannot judge a 5-year project after 5 days. You cannot evaluate a new skill after 3 attempts. You cannot determine the quality of a research program from one failed experiment. You cannot meaningfully judge certain physical changes from one morning's measurement. Every serious goal has a natural timescale. Chasing destroys our sense of that timescale because anxiety compresses time. 3 days feels like 3 months. One unanswered message feels permanent. One poor result feels definitive. One slow week becomes nothing is working. Before interpreting silence, ask: has enough time passed for this process to reasonably produce evidence? Not, am I tired of waiting? Those are different questions. Second, feedback. Silence is itself information, but its meaning depends on context. If nobody buys your product, that matters. If nobody responds to your applications, that matters. If readers repeatedly abandon the same section of your work, that matters. If the same experimental result appears repeatedly, that matters. But feedback must accumulate before patterns become visible. One rejection may tell you almost nothing. 50 similar rejections may tell you something important. One unsuccessful upload may be noise. A consistent pattern across dozens of comparable pieces may reveal a strategic problem. This is why Chapter 10 insisted on review windows. Without them, you react to events. With them, you interpret patterns. Third, controllable inputs. Ask: have I actually been doing what the strategy requires? This question can be uncomfortable. Sometimes we say something is not working when we have barely implemented it. The business is not growing, but we rarely contact customers. The creative career is stalled, but we seldom publish. The skill is not improving, but practice is inconsistent. The network is not expanding, but we avoid initiating conversations. In such cases, the strategy may not have failed. It may not have been properly tested, but the reverse matters too. If the controllable inputs have been consistent and high quality for a reasonable period, then you have earned the right to examine the strategy rather than merely blaming your discipline. Finally, evidence. This is the hardest one. Ask, what would I believe about the situation if my self-worth were not involved? That question removes some of the emotional distortion. Suppose this were someone else's business, someone else's application strategy, someone else's research project, someone else's creative plan. What would the evidence suggest? Continue? Adjust? Wait? Seek expert feedback? Run another experiment? Stop? Detachment allows all of those answers, including stop. There are things worth abandoning. There are relationships that should end, projects that should be closed, strategies that should be replaced, goals that belong to an earlier version of you. Detachment is not eternal persistence. Sometimes release means releasing the outcome. Sometimes it means releasing the method, and occasionally it means releasing the goal itself. But there is something even harder than deciding whether to persist. Living well while you do not know. Human beings often treat uncertainty as a temporary room in which real life cannot begin. Once I get the job, once the business grows, once they choose me, once I know the result, once the money improves, once the opportunity arrives, then I can relax, then I can feel secure, then I can enjoy myself, then life can begin. But notice what has happened. The future has become a permission slip for the present, and because the future has not signed it yet, you remain psychologically suspended. This returns us to the question, who are you during the period when your effort has not yet been rewarded? Are you still a person, or merely an applicant waiting to be accepted? Are you still capable of joy, or merely an entrepreneur waiting for revenue? Are you still worthy of your own respect, or merely a performer waiting for applause? Are you still living, or have you reduced the present to a corridor leading toward the result? There's a subtle tragedy in postponing your entire emotional life until uncertainty disappears, because uncertainty never disappears permanently. You get the job, then you wonder whether you will succeed. You get the relationship, then you fear losing it. You make the money, then you fear returning to where you started. You receive recognition, then you wonder whether you can repeat it. The object changes. The demand for reassurance remains, unless something deeper changes. Viktor Frankl repeatedly emphasized that human meaning cannot be reduced to comfort or favorable circumstances, that insight matters here, because perhaps the unanswered period is not meaningless simply because it has not yet produced the result you wanted. Your work still formed you. Your discipline still happened. Your courage still happened. Your learning still happened. Your relationships still exist. Your ordinary Tuesday still belongs to your life. None of this guarantees that the goal will arrive. That is precisely the point. If meaning depends entirely on the eventual outcome, then the outcome owns every day that came before it. Perhaps patience, at its deepest, is not believing. Something wonderful is definitely coming. Perhaps patience is quieter. I can remain here without inventing certainty. I can continue when evidence supports continuing. I can change when evidence supports changing. I can stop when stopping becomes wise. I can want deeply without demanding guarantees. And while the answer remains unknown, I do not have to disappear from my own life. There will still be difficult mornings. You will still wonder. You will still occasionally check. You will still feel disappointment when the inbox is empty. You will still want evidence. Detachment does not turn you into stone. It makes you less dependent on reassurance to remain psychologically intact. So when nothing seems to be happening, look carefully. Maybe more time is needed. Maybe the strategy needs changing. Maybe the goal needs reconsidering. Maybe something is developing beyond your current view. Maybe nothing will come from this particular effort. You do not yet know. And for once, you do not need to manufacture an answer. You can stand inside the unanswered question, still working where work is useful, still changing where change is intelligent, still living while the outcome remains undecided. Because beyond chasing, beyond forcing, beyond checking, and even beyond waiting, there is another state, not a state in which life finally obeys you, not a state in which every desire arrives, not a state in which uncertainty disappears. Something quieter, A life in which you no longer require reality to constantly send evidence that you are safe, worthy, successful, chosen, or on the right path. The circumstances may still be unresolved. The answer may still be coming, or it may never come. And yet, for the first time, you are no longer waiting for life to reassure you before you allow yourself to live. Chapter 12. The quiet state where life begins to move. There comes a point when the chase becomes quiet. Not because every question has been answered, not because every door has opened, not because the message finally arrived, or the numbers finally rose, or the person finally chose you, or the money finally became enough, or the opportunity finally appeared. Something else changes. You stop abandoning yourself while waiting. That is the deeper movement beneath everything we have been discussing. Not passivity, not withdrawal, not indifference. Self-possession, the ability to remain with yourself while life remains unresolved. The inbox can still be empty, but you are no longer checking it as though your worth is hidden inside the next message. The analytics can still be slow, but the numbers no longer have permission to tell you whether the work mattered. The relationship can still contain uncertainty, but you no longer treat every silence as an emergency. The career can still be unfinished. The money can still be growing. The application can still be unanswered. And yet, your entire inner world is no longer standing at the door waiting for permission to continue. This is a quieter kind of power. It does not announce itself. It does not need a dramatic breakthrough. It is simply the return of attention to the life that is already here. For most of this book, we've been talking about what happens when desire becomes fear. What happens when effort becomes compulsion? What happens when care becomes monitoring? What happens when uncertainty becomes intolerable? But beneath all of that was another question. Can you remain whole while wanting something you do not yet have? That is the real test of detachment. Not whether you can stop wanting, whether you can want without disappearing into the wanting. There is a form of psychological flexibility in this, the ability to hold two truths at once. I care deeply, and I can survive disappointment. I want this, and I am still a person without it. I will work hard, and I cannot command the result. I will stay open, and I will not beg reality to reassure me every hour. I can grieve what has not happened without turning grief into self-erasure. This is not positive thinking. It is not pretending. It is not emotional numbness. It is a capacity to move through reality without requiring reality to become easier before you become steady. A detached person is not someone who has conquered desire. They are someone who has changed their relationship to desire. They no longer hold the goal like a hostage situation. They do not say, "Give me this outcome," or "I will lose myself." Instead, I will move toward what matters. I will act where action belongs. I will remain receptive to evidence. I will change when change is wise. And I will not hand over my entire identity to the result. That is self-possession. There is a sentence worth carrying into conclusion of this book. Peace is not the reward you receive after everything works out. Peace changes a person who is trying to work things out. That distinction matters, because if peace is postponed until the outcome arrives, then every uncertain period becomes unlivable. You cannot relax yet, cannot enjoy yet, cannot feel proud yet, cannot feel complete yet, cannot be present yet. Everything is deferred. But when peace becomes a way of participating in uncertainty, something subtle happens. You make better decisions, not magical decisions, clearer ones. You stop confusing urgency with importance. You stop interfering with processes that need time. You stop demanding reassurance from people who cannot provide permanent certainty. You stop changing direction every time anxiety rises. You stop reading every fluctuation as a verdict, and that change in behavior can make life appear to move differently. Sometimes relationships improve because the pressure leaves the room. Sometimes creative work improves because the creator is no longer trying to prove their worth with every piece. Sometimes performance improves because attention returns to the task instead of the self. Sometimes opportunities become easier to notice because your mind is no longer staring at one closed door. Sometimes persistence becomes sustainable because it is no longer powered entirely by panic. Sometimes you finally hear what reality has been telling you because you are no longer demanding that it say something else. This is not the universe rewarding detachment. It is what can happen when fear stops interfering with perception, judgment, and behavior. But there is another truth, a harder one. Sometimes detachment does not bring the thing back. The person does not return. The business does not recover. The application remains a no. The audience does not arrive. The plan changes. The future you wanted closes. And this is where detachment proves whether it was genuine. Because if you only let go in order to get the thing, you never really let go. You negotiated. You said, I will release my grip. If reality promises to reward me, that is still in control. Real release contains no such contract. Sometimes the gift of detachment is not receiving what you wanted. Sometimes it is discovering that your life was larger than the thing you were afraid to lose. That can feel almost shocking. The object that once occupied your entire emotional horizon becomes smaller, not meaningless. Smaller. You see it in proportion. You realize how much of your identity had been wrapped around it, how much attention you had surrendered, how much of the present you had postponed. And one day, you notice that you are no longer checking. Not because you force yourself to stop. You simply no longer need the information in the same way. The unanswered application is still unanswered, but you applied elsewhere. The old relationship still ended, but you did not end with it. The money is still imperfect, but your mind no longer treats every fluctuation as proof of danger. The work still has uncertain results, but you return to the work. This is what quiet freedom looks like. Not triumph, not certainty, not invulnerability. Continuity. You continue. There is something deeply human about wanting life to confirm us. Tell me I am chosen. Tell me I am safe. Tell me I am successful. Tell me I made the right decision. Tell me this will work. Tell me I matter. But life is inconsistent in the way it answers. Sometimes it says yes. Sometimes no. Sometimes later. Sometimes nothing. If your inner stability depends entirely on those answers, you will always be at the mercy of the next one. Self-possession begins when the question changes. Not, what is life telling me about my worth? But, how do I want to meet life from here? That is quieter and more durable. Perhaps this is a state where life begins to move. Not because everything outside finally rearranges itself, but because you do. You stop standing still inside one demand. You stop bargaining. You stop rehearsing fear. You stop asking the future to rescue the present. And suddenly, movement becomes possible again. You can see, choose, respond, leave, stay, begin, rest, try again. You are no longer frozen by the need for one particular answer. And this is where the entire book has been leading. Not toward a technique for getting what you want, toward a way of remaining yourself while wanting deeply, toward a life in which desire does not require desperation, toward effort without self-erasure, toward love without possession, toward ambition without captivity, toward uncertainty without collapse, toward peace that does not need to wait until the world signs off on it. The chase may still call you sometimes. The old urge to check, to force, to prove, to secure, to hold tighter. But now you recognize it. And recognition changes a relationship. You do not have to follow every urge back into the old pattern. You can pause, return, and stay with yourself. That is the quiet state, not the end of desire, the end of abandoning yourself for desire. And from here, the final lesson becomes simple. You can go after what matters without giving it ownership of you. Conclusion, let it come, let it go, keep yourself. There was a person at the beginning of this book who could not stop checking. The inbox, the message, the numbers, the application, the bank account, the expression on someone else's face. The small pieces of evidence that seem capable of answering a much larger question. Is my life going the way I need it to go? Perhaps by now the message arrived. Perhaps it never did. Perhaps the application became an acceptance. Perhaps it became another silence. Perhaps the numbers finally climbed. Perhaps they barely moved. Perhaps the relationship survived. Perhaps two people who once thought they could not live without each other eventually learned that they could. Perhaps the great opportunity came, or perhaps life quietly placed another door somewhere they had not been looking. We do not need to know, because if this book ended by telling you that detachment guarantees the outcome you desire, then everything we have said would collapse into another strategy for chasing. Let go so that you can get it. Stop caring so that they will come back. Detach so that money will arrive. Release so that success will find you. That is not detachment. That is desire wearing a disguise. Real detachment asks something far more difficult. Can you release your demand that life must unfold in a particular way and still participate in it completely? Can you care without becoming captive? Can you hope without making hope a condition for peace? Can you work without asking every result to tell you who you are? That is where chasing ends. Not when desire disappears, but when self-possession begins. The opposite of chasing is not quitting. It is self-possession. It is the quiet realization that nothing outside you should be given the authority to determine whether you are allowed to inhabit your own life fully. This does not make you invulnerable. You will still be disappointed. You will still miss people. You will still want things badly. There will still be nights when uncertainty follows you into bed. There will still be rejection that hurts more than you expected. There will still be ambitions that consume years and produce less than you hoped. Detachment does not prevent pain. It prevents pain from becoming a verdict on your worth. And that difference changes everything. Epictetus built much of his philosophy around a distinction human beings repeatedly forget. Some things depend upon us, and others do not. 2,000 years later, the difficulty remains. We understand a distinction intellectually, then someone does not reply, and suddenly we want jurisdiction over another person's mind. We submit an application and want jurisdiction over the decision. We publish our work and want jurisdiction over the audience. We love someone and want jurisdiction over whether they stay. We work hard and want jurisdiction over when effort becomes reward. The mature life begins when responsibility becomes precise. You take responsibility for your conduct, your preparation, your honesty, your boundaries, your discipline, your choices, your willingness to learn, your willingness to leave when leaving becomes necessary, your willingness to remain when remaining is wise. And then you stop claiming ownership over what was never yours to command, not because you no longer care, because you finally understand where your power ends. There is enormous freedom in saying, I want this, but I refuse to worship it, because worship is different from desire. Whatever you worship becomes larger than you. Its arrival can save you. Its absence can destroy you. Its approval can elevate you. Its rejection can reduce you. And without noticing, you begin arranging your entire inner life around something outside yourself. A career, a person, a number, a title, a body, an audience, money, recognition, one particular future. You begin saying, when this happens, I will breathe. When this happens, I will believe in myself. When this happens, I will know the struggle was worth it. When this happens, I will finally feel enough. And life becomes a waiting room. Detachment opens a door, not necessarily the door to the thing you wanted, the door out of the waiting room. You can want something without worshiping it. You can work for something without making it your identity. You can love someone without possessing them. You can pursue success without requiring success to prove your worth. You can act without controlling. And perhaps most importantly, you can wait without psychologically standing at the window. That may be one of the hardest freedoms to learn, because there will always be something unresolved. After one answer comes, another question appears. After one goal is reached, another begins. After one uncertainty disappears, life manufactures another. If peace requires complete certainty, peace will always remain one event away. So the work was never to eliminate uncertainty. The work was to become someone who could remain present inside it. There's an old mistake hidden inside ambition. We think the future version of ourselves will finally grant the present version permission to feel worthy. The successful self, the wealthy self, the admired self, the chosen self, the loved self, the accomplished self, So we chase that person through years of our lives. But perhaps growth was never supposed to be a rescue mission. You can improve because you are curious. Build because you have something worth building. Study because there is something worth understanding. Earn because resources create possibilities. Love because another human being matters. Create because something inside you deserves expression. Strive because excellence is beautiful. None of these requires self-rejection as fuel. You do not have to hate where you are to move somewhere else. And you do not have to become indifferent to become free. There is another freedom hidden here. The freedom to discover that you were wrong about what you needed. Sometimes the thing you chase arrives, and you are grateful. Sometimes it arrives, and you discover it cannot carry the psychological weight you placed upon it. Sometimes it never arrives, and sometimes years later, you look back at something you once begged life to give you, and feel astonished by how certain you were that you could not be happy without it. This is why detachment contains humility. You know what you want, but you admit that you do not know everything. You act according to the best information available. Then you remain awake enough to notice when reality teaches you something new. Perhaps persistence is required. Perhaps adaptation. Perhaps patience. Perhaps departure. Detachment leaves you free enough to find out. And now the argument becomes very simple. You have one life. There will be things worth pursuing with extraordinary seriousness. Pursue them. There will be people worth loving deeply. Love them. There will be work worthy of years of discipline. Do it. There will be risks worth taking. Take them carefully. There will be moments when you must ask again, try again, begin again, stand your ground, change your mind, walk away, or wait. Do what the moment requires. But when the action is finished, allow it to be finished. Do not perform it another 100 times inside your head. Do not turn waiting into work. Do not turn uncertainty into evidence against yourself. Do not turn another person's freedom into your emergency. Do not make tomorrow responsible for giving meaning to today. Go after what matters with open eyes. Give it your attention, your preparation, your patience, your discipline. Give it the courage required to begin and the humility required to change. Give it the hours. Give it the work. Give it the honest attempt. Then leave something untouched. You. Keep the part of yourself that can still eat dinner while waiting for the email. Keep the part that can sleep after submitting the application. Keep the part that can love without begging. Keep the part that can lose without becoming lost. Keep the part that knows disappointment is an experience, not an identity. Keep the part that can look at a closed door without deciding that the entire world has closed. Let success come and enjoy it. Let praise come and receive it. Let love come and cherish it. Let opportunity come and meet it prepared. But remember, anything that can come can also change. Anything that can be gained can sometimes be lost. So build your deepest home, somewhere that circumstance cannot completely own. One day, perhaps without noticing when it happened, you will reach for the phone and stop, not because you are pretending not to care. You simply realize there is nothing more to do right now. The message will come, or it will not. The numbers will rise, or they will teach you something. The person will stay, or life will ask you to survive their leaving. The plan will work, or reality will require another plan. And you will still be here, not untouched, not indifferent, not fearless, but here, whole enough to continue, free enough to change, quiet enough to see what comes next. So desire deeply, act deliberately, love completely, work seriously, wait patiently, and when life places something beautiful in your hands, hold it with gratitude rather than terror. Because the deepest form of detachment is not learning how to lose everything. It is learning that you do not have to lose yourself with it. Let it come, let it go, keep yourself.